Hey everyone, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for helping me reach 100 subscribers. I honestly couldn't have done this without your love, support, and constant encouragement. Every like, comment, and subscribe means a lot to me. Now let's keep this journey going. Our next target is 200 subscribers, and I know we can do it together. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's grow as a family. Thank you once again. After his earth-shaking defeat at the hands of Monkey D. Luffy, Kaido of the Beasts expects death, not rebirth. Awakening in an unfamiliar dungeon as a dragon Xenos, Kaido finds himself in a world where monsters think, feel, and fear extinction. Stripped of his empire but not his will, the former Yonko does what he has always done best: survive, grow stronger, and lead. As gods, adventurers, and monsters collide, Kaido begins building a new kind of crew, challenging the balance of Orario while learning what it truly means to protect those under his banner. In a world of gods and heroes, a fallen emperor rises once more, this time as the king of monsters. Disclaimer. This story do not belong to me. The author is it Wrong for a Yonko to Reincarnate as a Xenos in the Dungeon? By Hakamaster 38. Respect to author.
Chapter 6, Interlude, Meetings and Decisions. The walk back to the surface was strangely quiet as both the Zeus and Hera familia looked at Althea and her sister, who were walking besides one another and speaking amiably with one another as the others looked on, strangely mesmerized by the sight. It was not uncommon for the sisters to speak to one another, but what was uncommon was Althea's rather animated responses to her sister's questions. Normally, Althea was stone-faced and serious and only spoke to her sister in the privacy of Mituria's room or in quiet whispers at meal times. Now though, she seemed much more open than she had ever been before and without hiding her emotions as she usually did. It was normal for her familia to remain as quiet as possible around her because of how much she hated noise, but now it would appear that she no longer cared. Despite the jovial conversation, no one else dared to speak, mostly because of the death-like presence surrounding the goddess Hera as she followed behind them. She found herself thinking of unique and strange ways of getting back at those Xenos pirates for daring to mess with her innocent little Althea. The goddess didn't know what they did, but she'd get back at them, damn it. As the group walked up the stairs to their familia's meeting place within the Tower of Babel, Althea couldn't help but notice the beauty of the view outside one of the windows. She had never really taken the time to admire it, but now, after getting some clarity on what true power was and how sorely lacking she was, it was almost as though a weight of responsibility on her shoulders had been lightened but not removed. Despite still having some bitterness about the way her life turned out, she couldn't help but realize that she only had one life, even with the god's blessing, and as such it was up to her to make the best of it. Suddenly she thought back to the words of wisdom the siren, Ray, had imparted to her in the form of a song. Gather up all of the crew. It's time to ship out Bink's brew. Sing a song and play along for all the oceans wide. After all is said and done, you'll end up a skeleton. So spread your tail from dawn till dusk upon these foamy seas. She remembered the end part of the song's lyrics. Apparently it was an old song that Kaido had learned in his previous life. He had taught it to Ray when she had asked whether there were any songs that he could remember from his past because of how exciting many of his adventures were. Ray didn't go into details of what these adventures were, but apparently they were great, especially with his crew beside him. It was partially due to this knowledge that she hadn't been actively distancing herself from her familia like she normally would. She wondered if it was possible for her familia members to share a bond of friendship like the one displayed by the members of the Xenos pirates. Her thoughts were interrupted, however, when a new voice spoke up and got her attention. Hey Althea, are you feeling alright? You're acting quite strange from what I remember your usual behavior to be. Herculea, her captain, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Then Althea performed an action that was most unexpected by everyone. She looked at her captain and smiled. She smiled. I'm perfectly fine. Actually, I'd go so far as to say that I've never been better. My time with the Xenos pirates has given me some clarity on many things in my life, she said with a serene smile before ending the conversation for now with, we can discuss this in more detail during the meeting. We're almost there after all, she said as the group got to the double doors of their private meeting room. After everyone was in the room and seated, Herculea began the meeting. Alright everyone, I'm sure we all know the reason for this meeting, but for context I'll explain the situation as best as I understand it. She began, making sure that all of the members' attention was on her and what was about to be spoken about. Roughly 4 days ago, an expedition to the deep floors, led by one of our level 7 executives Althea, was stopped by a group of monsters on the 21st floor. Now then, Althea, please explain the events from your perspective, she said, to which Althea nodded and got up from her seat before going to the podium that the captain had just vacated. Alfia's smile disappeared and she became serious. Alright, I'll get right to the explanation of what had happened. Do not interrupt me, she said seriously as she began her explanation to the others. With Uranus and Fels, the meeting between the two top familias and the newly discovered group known as the Xenos pirates had ended several hours ago. Fels was in the process of explaining how the meeting went with the god Uranus listening intently. And that's what happened during the meeting, explained the cloaked guild agent. The two were having their meeting in a secret room under the guild building. It was a place that Uranus used most of the time to pray to the dungeon and keep track of any anomalous activities within. Such as the birth of the Juggernaut several days ago at the hands of the Xenos pirates. Uranus was pleasantly surprised that things had turned out as well as they did. Tell me, Fels, what are your thoughts on this Kaido and his group? Are they trustworthy? The old god asked curiously. He had found it difficult to believe when Fels returned from his mission to the deep floors with news of intelligent monsters that had formed a group which they referred to as the Xenos pirates. It seemed absurd, but Fels had served Uranus for many years and wasn't one to joke or lie to him. As such, he was forced to accept the truth for what it was despite how impossible it may seem. Fels bowed slightly before answering, yes, I believe so, Lord Uranus. Though they are a group, their goals do not always align with the goals of the others, the sage began as he thought back to his conversations with them. Though most of them share the dream of living on the surface, their goals vary slightly from individual to individual, but the true exception to this desire is their leader Kaido. He has no interest in the surface and merely seeks adventure, which he mostly finds within the dungeon. Fels explained his conversations with the Xenos pirates before moving on to other issues. Lord Uranus, I believe we needed more eyes in the dungeon, especially with that small organization Evolus, moving around in the dungeon. Perhaps the Xenos pirates could help us keep an eye on things, though what concerns me is what they may ask for in return for such services. Fels ended his speech on this topic before something else came to mind. Speaking of which, now that the Zeus and Hera familias know about them, we can expect them to go on an expedition alongside one another and hopefully become stronger than anyone who came before, the cloaked agent said, to which Uranus nodded before putting his own thoughts on the matter. Fels, I've got a rather long-term mission for you. I need you to keep an eye on the Xenos pirates and report any suspicious activity they may be involved in. The god said, to which Fels merely bowed before responding, it shall be done, Lord Uranus, I'll be on my way, he said before disappearing into the shadows of the room. Please be careful, Fels, Uranus muttered before returning to his prayers for the dungeon. Back with the Hera and Zeus familias. After explaining the expedition until the point where she was knocked out by Kaido, this left the entire room in silence. Now Alfea was not the strongest member of her familia, but she was a level 7 executive. She could probably defeat every adventurer below level 7 in Orario on her own without too much trouble. So to hear that she'd been defeated with one hit, left the entire room in an oppressive silence. Alfea let them think over her words for quite a while before Mituria spoke up and asked her to continue. Please, Alfea, tell us more, what happened after that? She asked, finally snapping most of them back to the meeting at hand. Alfea did a quick sweep of the room with her eyes, and seeing that all attention was now back on her, she continued her retelling. After I came to my senses, I found myself trapped inside one of the dungeon walls. She was interrupted by one of the older executives of the Hera familia who exclaimed, wait, what? You were inside one of the dungeon walls, how the hell is that possible? Did they turn you into a monster? He yelled in confusion, to which Alfea sighed while rubbing her ears at his shout. Sigh, if you would just be quiet and listen, I will get to that. Alfea said with a sigh and a glare at the scandalous individual before continuing, anyway, I was greeted by the lizard man. His name is Light and he explained my situation to me, he even answered my questions concerning what they wanted from me, she explained to the two familias present. After he revealed what they wanted to know, that being information about the surface, I immediately clammed up and refused to speak.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
My efforts were useless though, because as soon as the lizard man answered my questions he got up and left. Then Kaido entered to ask the same questions. She trailed off with a shudder that remained unnoticed only by the lower-ranked adventurers and her goddess. All of the executives narrowed their eyes at her. Alfea noticed this but ignored it in favor of continuing her story. I was in no position to deny him the information, so I told him what he wanted to know. Though I found some of his questions to be rather strange, she noted with a complicated expression on her face. Zeus seemed to be intrigued by this point she made and decided to speak up. What did he ask about? I suppose he'd want to know about the abilities of the adventurers, the god of lightning asked while rubbing his beard. Alfea begrudgingly acknowledged the old pervert's question and answered truthfully because she knew that no mortal could lie to a god, not even her. No, he had no interest in the surface. Although he did ask about the most advanced weaponry we had and even inquired about something called a gun. After explaining the magic swords to him and informing him about never having heard about this gun, he ended his questions and ordered one of his followers to release me. she explained. Zeus and Hera seemed to be having a panic attack, while the others just looked confused. How does he know about those? They don't exist in this world. Hera whispered loudly to Zeus, who responded with, I don't know, maybe Althea can shed some more light on these pirates, he said in response as he turned back to Althea, who seemed suspicious of them after hearing their conversation from the podium. Regardless, a gargoyle entered the room and released me from the wall. It was as though he could control the very shape of the dungeon at will. After I was released, they led me to a large open cave where the others were waiting. After each of them introduced themselves, we sat down and had a dinner of different dungeon fruits before the siren Ray gave me a salamander wool cloak to keep myself warm. Althea explained her stay with the Xenos. The others seemed intrigued by her tale of the strange monsters. After some time in their company, I found that they behaved more like a family than most familias I know. Kaido is their leader, with Ray in second command while the others all have their own roles. Althea explained the hierarchy of the organization formed by the Xenos pirates. Despite their appearance, most of the Xenos pirates were quite amicable and easygoing. I was able to learn many things from both Light and Ray because of this. Now this may come as a shock to some of you, but I believe that they are the reincarnations of either adventurers or monsters who have died before, she said, shocking the room into silence once again. After several minutes of processing all the new information, they decided to move the meeting along. Why would you believe that, Althea? Did they say something in that direction? Maxim spoke up for the first time in the meeting. He found Althea's words hard to believe despite having met the Xenos pirates personally. The silver-haired executive seemed to sigh a bit before responding, yes, and no. I say yes because according to Light, Kaido used to be a pirate captain on the high seas. At the same time I say no, because their behavior is too human to be practiced as I had first thought to be the case. Well, whatever they are, it's not something we're used to, she ended her explanation of the events. Now on to something more pressing, she began again. Namely the strange abilities they have shown, such as Ray being able to create and control light, Gross being able to shape the dungeon as he pleases, and finally Kaido, who can change his form into an azure dragon that can control the elements with ease, she said, getting the needed reaction from everyone. Though what she said caused many to become fearful or nervous, her next words made them feel a bit conflicted. Regardless of the power they possess, it would seem as though they are at least willing to work with us. She began as she reached into a small bag that was given to her by one of the supporters back in the dungeon before removing the rolled-up papers given by the Xenos pirates. These are detailed maps of the lower floors of the dungeon starting from the 40th floor down to the 70th with labeled landmarks and a list of monsters that spawn there. Althea said as she showed one of the maps to the assembled familias to see. Seeing the conflicted looks from her comrades, she decided to end her speech and let the captains decide what to do next. Hera and Zeus familias, despite my gratitude towards them for showing me how much I needed some humility, I now know how much we need to prepare for the future, just in case they become our enemies. She thought back to her utter defeat at the hands of Kaido and her new desire to surpass her own limits in the hopes of one day defeating him in battle. Before, I have always held back in hopes of prolonging my life, but now that is no longer the case. At this point it doesn't matter if I live or die. So instead from now on I'll be doing the absolute best that I can, regardless of the consequences, she said, ending her speech with a small smile towards the others. It was something Ray had told her in one of their conversations. Many of the younger adventurers were inspired by her words to improve themselves and become stronger. The more experienced captains and executives were not impressed but were rather suspicious of her sudden shift in personality. From a cold, calm and collected hater of noise to an easygoing, friendly and inspirational person after a day and a half in captivity. Could Althea be an imposter? They were about to speak up and question her on her suspicious behavior, but were stopped by a surprisingly common event even before she had been captured by the pirates. It was so jarring that even they, the executives, were left in a stunned silence after witnessing it. Althea then left the podium with the words, "That's all that is of any importance, let's move the meeting along, shall we?" Having ended her explanation, as the level 7 stepped down a small step from the raised podium, her right foot got caught behind her left and she found herself suddenly tripping over her own feet and fell flat on her face. Althea's hated clumsiness has struck again. The heterochromatic adventurer got up, dusted herself off after getting up from the floor before looking right at the occupants of the entire room. "Not a word," she said with a twitching eyebrow. Everyone remained silent. The executives and captains sighed in relief as it became clear that she wasn't an imposter. With that out of the way, Zeus got up and walked to the front of the two familias. "Alright, now that we know more about who and what we're dealing with, let's get down to business," the god of lightning began as the meeting turned in a new direction, namely the future. With the Xenos pirates in the dungeon, things were far from peaceful since the end of the meeting with the surface dwellers. Immediately after the meeting had ended and the Xenos pirates had returned to the hidden village, Kaido ordered an immediate dive to the deep floors. He wanted to take any devil fruits that might have grown since Ray had gone to kill Udias. The former emperor knew that despite his crew's individual strength, they could be overwhelmed by the numbers if they were dragged into a long-lasting fight with the adventurers. For this reason the Xenos pirates held no illusions about the surface dwellers trusting them, as such caution needed to be practiced especially in the current alliance. Within an hour the Xenos pirates were ready with Gross being surrounded by large leather backpacks. "Alright everyone, let's go," Kaido yelled as the others responded in kind with yells of their own before charging out of the hidden village. An hour later, the Xenos had dived through 10 floors over the last hour. They made quick work of the monsters while Gross grabbed the magic stones and drop items. Ryu on the other hand was using his devil fruit ability to search the trees for any devil fruits that might be there. While Kaido, Ray and Lied mowed through the monsters on their way down with reckless abandon. Here on the 31st floor they battled. Soon Ryu roared and the group knew that he had found something. Immediately the combat group doubled their efforts and finished off the rest of the horde of monsters in just over a minute after the dragon had roared. A moment after the floor became quiet, Ryu flew over to the group with 2 devil fruits in one of his clawed hands. Good work Ryu," Kaido said with a nod in the green dragon's direction. "Everyone, listen up. We need to collect as many of the devil fruits as possible. We cannot allow any of the adventurers to consume one of these fruits in case they decide to move against us," he said. Ray, Lied, Gross and Ryu nodded affirmatively in response to his words. "I'm not concerned about myself as much as I am about the rest of you. I'm sure all of you have sensed the power of the adventurers from the surface. Several of them are stronger than some of you. This dive is not only to gain more devil fruits but also so that all of you may improve your abilities. Do you understand?" he asked seriously at the end. His crew simply nodded with determined looks on their faces. Despite having been reborn in this dungeon and having a new lease on life as some would say, Kaido found himself falling back into one of his old habits. That habit being, taking any advantage he could against his enemies before they could strike against him or his crew. Right now their allies had given them time, which he would not be foolish enough to waste. His thoughts ended when he saw the determined gazes of his crew. "Then let's go. We're going to surpass every adventurer or monster that has ever existed in this world," the former emperor yelled, to which his crew members raised an arm or wing in the case of Ray before letting loose a loud battle cry or roar as they dived down deeper. As the Xenos descended the floors of the dungeon an individual was looking around the hidden village on the 21st floor. Xenos Pirates' hidden base on the 21st floor. Fell stood in the center of the empty base that he had met the leader of the Xenos Pirates before. To the guild agent's dismay, there was no one here. He was all alone. He contemplated leaving and coming back later but realized that risked him missing them when they returned. Cyfels decided to sit down and wait for them to return. "I hope they get back soon," he muttered to himself. Chapter 7, Preparing for the Expedition. The dungeon city of Warario was a bustling center of commerce and the center of the world. Merchants sold their wares, children ran through the streets playing games while their parents watched them attentively as they spoke to their friends about simple things like dinner or what clothes they would like to buy when they got the money for it. In one of the open parks where children were playing amongst the trees and adults had simple conversation with one another, seated on a park bench was a pair of white-haired women who were enjoying the weather in each other's company as they spoke about small things that didn't have much importance but was used to pass the time. These two were in fact Althea and her sister Mituria. The former had taken a break from her dungeon diving to spend some time with her sister. Something she had been neglecting somewhat over the past 4 months, due to the Xenos pirates and the Zeus and Hera familias preparing for a large-scale expedition to the lower floors. And since Althea was the most knowledgeable about the group of pirates and an executive of her familia, she was routinely sent to speak with them and to inform them about the plans for the expedition as well as to inform her familia about any new members that might have joined the group since the last time she was there. Because of this and her own self-imposed training regiment, she had very little time for her sister.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
Today was a special break she was able to get in her schedule and she used it to spend some time with her sister. Now the reason she was able to get the time with her sister was because of the expedition that would begin tomorrow. As such, all members of both familias were ordered to take a break to be well rested for the journey down to the deep floors. It was just a few minutes before noon and the two sisters had been making small talk for a few hours now, mostly to catch up on what had been missed over the past few months, namely, he's so funny in the way he says and does things. I mean, there was this one time he was explaining to Lord Zeus how he accidentally killed one of their horses. Mituria said with a small giggles. Apparently he accidentally had the horse crushed by a supply wagon as they went down a hill, but his words to Lord Zeus went something along the lines of, I guess every horse has his day, but then Zeus responded with, you mean, every dog has his day. But Randolph just said, that may be, but if the dog was a horse, then today was his day. Ha ha ha. Mituria laughed as she retold the story to her sister. Althea seemed to sigh in resignation, which didn't go unnoticed by her younger sister, who stopped laughing soon after, a serious expression taking over her face before she sighed. Sigh, Althea, what's wrong? Is it something I said? She asked curiously. Mituria had noticed the change in her sister after she had been returned to the surface after the Xenos pirates incident. Tell me, Althea, is there anything that is bothering you? I've noticed that you're not speaking to me as openly as you did a few months ago, so what happened? Mituria asked her sister. She was curious about her sister's change in attitude. Althea seemed to flinch slightly at her sibling's words, mostly because of the answer she would have to give. The Level 7 executive thought for a moment before answering the question. I don't like the man you have chosen as your own. He is not worthy of your attention or affection, and yet you chose him nonetheless, she said with a frown as she turned away from her sister. Though I don't approve of him, I'll leave it up to you, she ended the topic that they were currently on. Mituria seemed shocked and saddened by her sister's words but was grateful that she decided to leave it in her hands, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. Thank you, Althea. I really appreciate it, she said with a smile, to which Althea nodded in response before looking up at the sky. Hey Mituria, it's already noon. Let's get something to eat before we get back to the Familia home. I've got a story to tell you about the pirates, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it, she said as she got up and extended her hand to her sister, who accepted it and was pulled up from the bench. With that, the two left the park to find something to eat. This would be the last time the two of them could speak for a long time, so they were going to make the most of it. With the Xenos pirates. Over the past 4 months the Xenos pirates had been incredibly busy with their own preparations and what they believed was needed for their own future. Under the leadership of Kaido they were able to turn their hidden bases into miniature military strongholds with buildings built for defense in each of them. With Althea and Orpheus regularly paying the group a visit, they were able to figure out how to use magic stones for utilities as is done on the surface. Simple things, such as producing light or heating water, became common practice for them. Soon an idea hit Kaido after he saw Ryu using the devil fruit ability of his Woods fruit to control plants and have them drain the nutrients and energy of the monsters and their magic stones back to himself. The Green Dragon followed Kaido to their base on the 50th floor before the former emperor explained his plans. With his captain's guidance, Ryu was able to create a tree that at first lived on the energy of the magic stones of monsters that had been killed by the Xenos pirates, but this came with the drawback that it would reach out and attack anyone with magic except for the Green Dragon himself. This problem was resolved by figuring out how to have the tree drain the magic directly from the dungeon itself. After a month of trial and error they managed to have the roots and branches grow downwards and upwards respectively through the floors and walls of the dungeon, wrapping around the bases of other trees and plants throughout the dungeon all the way from the 50th floor up to the 18th floor in the safe zone. This megastructure allowed Ryu to gain massive amounts of information in the dungeon and allowed them to find others like them more easily. But to be more precise, this plant-based megastructure, which had been named Eden by the pirates after a heated discussion, had a different purpose. That being the world's first centralized power grid, one that got its energy from the dungeon itself. This basically made it a limitless source of energy for the Xenos pirates, and they were already using its energy for their own utilities without having to replace used magic stones. It was also because of the Green Dragon that the Xenos pirates had also gained several new members. Namely, a Fomor named For, an Arachne named Ranye and a Lamia named Laura. This brought the total number of Xenos to 8, though they were still looking for more, speaking of which the new members were quite happy to be included into the group even if For was incapable of expressing it verbally. With Gross' ability to mold the ground into any shape, it was very easy to construct buildings and place their special treasures in hidden places within these new buildings. They had enough dwelling places for at least a dozen more Xenos in each base. This meant that they always had more places to hide their special treasures. Although they didn't look anything like the buildings on the surface, mostly because Kaido had minimal influence on the construction with the exception of the Xenos castle on the 50th floor, which the former emperor had specifically designed to look like Onigashima from his original world. The former emperor hadn't gotten around to naming the castle though because of how busy the group was. Speaking of busy, the new members were quickly put to work with different tasks. Ranye was given the job of reinforcing their security by creating very thin webs to act as an early warning system in case one of the other members missed an intruder with their haki. Laura was tasked with assisting Gross with the transport of goods from the lower floors and into their bases. For had been given the responsibility to create and maintain the group's weapons and equipment. Kaido had even drawn the blueprints of several weapons that he could remember from the Grand Line. Weapons such as the gun, cannon and even a battleship that the group would hide in one of the floors of the Water Kingdom when it was done. Unfortunately, the new members were still in the process of learning how to use the colors of ambition in the small amount of time. The three of them were eager to learn and practiced as much as they could when they had the time to do so. It was unfortunate, but Kaido, being as busy as he was with his planning, didn't have the time to teach them directly like he did with the others. Despite these obstacles, they have each consumed a devil fruit and did their best to practice with the abilities granted. For was drawn to the Paramesha class fruit named the Heat fruit. It allowed him to warm up his body to incredible temperatures that could even melt metal. It was for this reason he was given the order to smith all of the Xenos pirates' weapons so that they wouldn't have to steal them from adventurers like they used to. Ranye, on the other hand, had consumed the Paramesha class poison fruit. This allowed her to produce a variety of different poisons not found in the dungeon. This made her incredibly deadly, especially as her regular battle tactics involved sneak attacks against her enemies until she could awaken her own haki. Lastly would be Laura, who had eaten the Zone-class devil fruit, the snake fruit, model King Cobra, which allowed her to transform into a large hooded King Cobra. This fruit gave her an incredible increase to her durability and strength and also allowed her to produce a powerful venom from her fangs that could even kill monsters much larger than herself with a single bite. Kaido had been impressed by the growth of the crew despite its relatively small size. They still had much more quality over quantity, and this was proven when the newest members were able to take down the monster Rex Goliath while working as a team. Soon they would be tasked with taking down the floor bosses individually, but that could happen after the expedition with the Zeus and Hera familias. The Xenos pirates had also been trading magic stones and drop items they had collected in their daily dungeon dives for things that couldn't be found in the dungeon, such as special metals like orichalcum or adamantine. Sometimes even simple things like pots or pans for cooking food or chairs and tables for comfort. For now the group was relaxing after a day of fighting in the dungeon with the monsters of the lower floors. Everyone was seated on the cushioned chairs provided by the guild with an array of dungeon fruits before them and some meat and alcohol from the surface, also courtesy of the guild. They were really grateful to Fells for his assistance in that regard, even though Fells would not be diving alongside them. I'm still a bit weary of the adventurers from the surface. Are we sure we can trust them? Ranier asked before taking another drink from her ale. Her question was answered by Ray, who responded with, well, it's a bit complicated. You see, we've made an agreement with them to prevent conflict between us, but I suppose it only holds until one side breaks it, the siren explained to her younger crew member. The Arachne seemed to tilt her head to the side in a confused manner. But why do we even need to do that? With Kaido on our side, we should be strong enough to beat them in anything the dungeon could throw at us, so why play nice with them at all? She asked her superior, but it was Kaido who responded to her. The reason we work with them is the continued safety of the crew, the former emperor began to explain. You see, young ones, if we got into a serious fight with them, there's no doubt that I could win the battle against them. My concern though is the rest of you. I don't look down on those who lose a battle against an opponent who is stronger than themselves, but here in this place defeat means death. So this alliance is only a means to buy time until we're strong enough to stand on our own. Kaido ended his explanation to the young Arachne. I think I understand, alright. Please forgive me for questioning your decisions, Captain. Ranier said with a nod. It grew quiet for a while before Laura spoke up, having a question of her own. Despite her young age, the Lamia wasn't afraid to speak what was on her mind, and most of the time misunderstanding the meaning of their words. This sometimes annoyed her fellow crew members. Captain, I've been wondering about something for a while now. What is your relationship with that Althea woman? She does come round quite often, doesn't she? She asked with a look that Kaido couldn't place. Ray glared at the young Xenos with contempt. How dare this little brat ask him something like that? He doesn't have a relationship with that woman, not at all, the Golden Siren thought furiously. The former emperor answered regardless of his confusion at the question, well, we fought a couple months back, but she couldn't last even one round with me before passing out. It does look like she's at least trying to improve her stamina, well, I think at the very least since she was last here. Kaido explained, and his response seemed to be somehow misinterpreted by the Lamia, but he didn't seem to care though. Laura's mind was running a mile a minute as her skin gained a slightly flushed hue. She couldn't even last one round. Now she's trying to improve her stamina. She'd been practicing since the last time she'd been here. The Lamia's thoughts went down a very different path that was ignored by all except Ray, who seemed to have gotten even angrier than before. The Siren's thoughts were of a much different nature. Oh come on, Kaido. How could you not see the misunderstanding those words would cause? Laura looks like she's about to have a nosebleed. Ray thought angrily while the others continued their own conversations without even noticing the look the Siren was giving the Lamia, who in turn was looking at Kaido with a blush on her cheeks. I just want this night to end so that we can begin the expedition and get it over and done with, the Siren despaired to herself. With Uranus and Fells, the two mediators were conversing about the expedition that would begin in a few hours and the great change it would bring to the world. It was an unprecedented event, adventurers and monsters working together to achieve more than either of them could ever hope to attain on their own. It was something the first god to descend never thought he'd see. Tell me, Fells, have the Zeus and Hera familias begun their dive? Uranus asked his hooded agent. Fells nodded in response. They began their dive a little over an hour ago and should reach the 18th floor a few minutes from now, before meeting with the Xenos pirates on the 21st floor. He explained calmly before uttering a question that he had kept to himself until now. Lord Uranus, I know that the two groups have been in contact with one another for several months now, but I have my doubts that they can truly get along with one another. What are your thoughts on this matter? He asked curiously, to which the god of wind responded, I believe the dangers of the dungeon will force them to work together with one another or die. Do not worry, Fells, just have faith, he said calmly as they began talking about other topics. Now then, Fells, what have you found out about Evolus in your investigations? Uranus asked seriously, to which Fells responded with, I've discovered 3 familias that are a part of the group, namely, the Rudra, Apate and Electo familias, the guild agent explained. With the Zeus and Hera familias on the 21st floor. The massive expedition force arrived on the 21st floor and found that the floor was surprisingly empty, a sign that the Xenos pirates had already cleared the floor in preparation for their arrival to the last of the middle floors. The executives and captains of both familias were at the forefront of each section of their battle formations. There were over 300 adventurers and supporters in the expedition. They were all holding their breath in the hopes that the monsters wouldn't betray them in the deep floors of the dungeon and just bail. Before such thoughts could be said aloud, a loud voice caught everyone's attention and had several of them drawing their weapons. "So you guys finally showed up. We were starting to think that you'd chicken out and leave the expedition to us, ha ha ha." The voice spoke. Immediately all of the adventurers turned to the voice. Some of them had their swords drawn when they saw 7 monsters sitting casually on a group of rocks. They had been informed about the new Xenos that had joined the group, but seeing them had several men blushing at the beauty of Rei, Laura and Ranier, and several women hot under the collar after seeing Kaido in a tight black open leather jacket that exposed his abs and tight leather pants with dark combat boots. Alfia sighed in annoyance at this before stepping forward and greeting the group of pirates. "Hello Xenos pirates, it's been a week since our last meeting, but I hope you've all been well. Shall we begin our expedition, or is there something else you need to do first?" She asked before noticing something and raising a question about it. "Also, why are there only 7 of you? Where's the Fomor that was part of your group?" She asked as both groups began to move towards the deep floors. "If something should happen that we need to deal with and all of us are gone, it would be unfortunate for Fells, who would most likely bring the message, so we're leaving 4 behind to deal with anything that might come up." Rei explained, to which Alfia nodded, understanding their reasoning on the matter. "Well then, let's really begin this expedition, let's go." With the go-ahead from all 3 of the captains, the massive group charged into the deeper floors of the dungeon. Chapter 8, Expedition Part 1. These were but a few of the many attacks and battle cries that filled the dungeon as the combined Zeus and Hera familias alongside the Xenos pirates' expedition to the deep floors continued. They had torn their way through the last of the middle floors and entered the Amphisbaena's territory in the Water Kingdom. The group had been making good time as they hadn't had to stop for many of the stronger monsters on these floors. The Xenos pirates would clear out the initial waves, leaving the rest for the adventurers. They had even encountered a few rare monsters such as a huge moss and a mermaid, but as with all monsters, they were killed and their magic stones and drop items taken before the expeditions moved on. The group was currently on the 26th floor fighting a massive horde of monsters, though this wasn't a problem as the group had numbers and strength on their side as well. The executives weren't doing much because it was decided that the lower-ranked adventurers needed to increase their status. The executives would only step in if things became too dangerous for them to handle. With that in mind, the members of the Xenos pirates were also asked to stand down unless a very large group of monsters showed up or they encountered the Amphisbaena. It was the only floor boss that could move to different floors after it was spawned by the dungeon. This strategy had been working rather well so far and would be continued for a while still. So the massive group of level 4s and 5s were currently slaughtering the monsters as the group proceeded to the next floor. From time to time, the Xenos pirates would intervene if they sensed an attack that was too dangerous to risk hitting one of their allies. Other than that, they only did minimal cleanup on the monsters that were missed. "So tell me, Kaido, what exactly do the Xenos pirates do in the dungeon besides killing monsters?" Herculea asked the captain of the Xenos pirates, who was drinking from a gourd filled with water. Apparently his second-in-command requested that he remain sober until they encountered a serious problem. He agreed reluctantly after she let him keep the alcohol on him with a promise of several gallons to drown in later. Kaido seemed to think about it for a moment before answering her. "We map unexplored areas of the dungeon and find safe zones for the guild's records, but mostly we seek adventure. We're pirates after all. What about you?" The Xenos pirates may appear to be subservient to the guild, but that couldn't be further from the truth, mostly because of their normally outrageous demands in exchange for their services. The former emperor's question in response to the leaders of the expedition was left unanswered for a moment as they walked at a leisurely pace while the others killed the monsters in the background of the conversation. He had been wondering about the purpose of adventurers because they normally don't seem to be having an adventure when they're in the dungeon. There was nothing too dangerous at the moment, so they felt confident enough to have a casual conversation for now. The captain of the Hera Familia chuckled at his question. "Hee, we're the ones who explore the depths of the dungeon in search of adventure and riches beyond what is found on the surface," she said with pride before looking to Rei. "I guess we're not that different from one another now, are we?" she said. The true meaning of her words was not missed by the siren. Rei sighed before responding, "Yeah, we're not much different from each other at all. I'm pretty sure that I was on the surface before I was reborn as a siren. All of the Xenos pirates have dreams of the surface. We believe them to be memories of our previous lives," she explained. The executives had heard this from Alfia before, but to hear it directly from one of the Xenos pirates gave it much more credibility. Before they realized it, the group had arrived on the 27th floor, and the executives immediately unsheathed their weapons in preparation for battle. The tensions were high and all of the adventurers were preparing for a true fight for their lives while the Xenos pirates calmly prepared themselves for battle. Kaido removed Hisaikai from his back in a calm manner. Ray bent her knees in preparation for battle, while Ranier pulled down the visor of her helmet. Gross submerged himself and the supporters into the ground to keep them safe. Ryu sank his claws into the ground while Laura coiled her body in preparation for a strike, and Light unsheathed his scimitar and longsword while subtly coating the blades with haki. Here we go, was the thought going through everyone's minds. As the massive expedition entered the boss room on the 27th floor, everything became silent. There was no sound of monsters or even a light breeze. The only thing that could be heard was the breathing of the tense adventurers, and if one listened closely, they'd probably be able to hear their own heartbeats. The only sounds that could be heard were beat beat beat. Then suddenly crack. Asterisk. Suddenly, it was as though the entire room exploded as hordes of monsters burst from the walls, almost as though the dungeon was sending its antibodies to eliminate a massive infection that had burrowed deep into its depths. Had it been anyone else, they'd probably turn tail and run after seeing this emergence of destruction before them. Unfortunately for the dungeon, they weren't just like anyone else. The adventurers sprang into action with blades, spear and other weapons. Archers fired arrows with lethal precision while mages chanted their magic for devastating wide-ranged attacks. The executives were no longer idle as they fought alongside their familias. The Xenos pirates, seeing the chaos the floor was just thrown into, glanced at one another before diving into the fray. Rei, despite her long-ranged capabilities, preferred to preserve her stamina by fighting hand-to-hand or in her case foot-to-face. Her fighting style almost caused several adventurers to lose focus at the beauty of it as the siren twirled in the air before delivering a series of bone-shattering kicks that normally landed on her adversaries' faces or necks, resulting in instant death for the poor monsters. Light, on the other hand, had a more brutish fighting style, with his two swords enveloped in flames to hide his use of haki from the adventurers around him. He spun his blades with a twist of his wrist and bisected several Iguazu that tried to throw his balance off, while simultaneously decapitating a Lamia with a backward swing of his flaming longsword. This is fun, he thought to himself. Suddenly a harpy attempted to rain razor-sharp feathers down on the lizardman. Light prepared to deflect the feathers with his swords but was interrupted by several arrows made of some purple liquid that suddenly pierced the harpy's head, chest and abdomen. The flying monster seemed to shrivel like a prune before bursting into a cloud of ash. Light nodded to Ranier quickly before diving back into the fray with a loud battle cry. He knew that she was the only one in the entire expedition who used poison to fight. Meanwhile, Laura was using her claws to tear her way through a group of Voltimeria without much trouble. The only reason the Xenos pirates weren't mistaken for regular monsters was because of the armor they wore and the thick clothed capes draped over their shoulders. It was an idea put forward by Laura and seconded by Ranier, after seeing the clothing the adventurers wore. Although only Ranier and Four actually wore armor because of their naturally slow movements, the armor wouldn't slow them down too much. The others, who relied on speed, decided to go with a simple cape that hung on their shoulders and fastened with an elastic string. The only exception was Ryu, who had a sash around his midsection. All the clothing items worn by the Xenos pirates had been emblazoned with the group's Jolly Roger. This distinguished them from the rest of the group. After Maxim had seen the design of their clothes, he wanted to make it mandatory for his own familia members when out in public to distinguish themselves from other familias, but then thought better of it in case someone tries to target his familia specifically. Kaido stood and observed the ongoing battle as the insanity of melee combat and long-ranged magical attacks continued. From time to time he would smack a monster that tried to attack him. Then suddenly the entire room began to shake as a giant two-headed, long-necked, dragon-like monster burst forth from the ground. One of its heads was covered in white scales and it had a pair of blue eyes. Amphisbena seemed to be observing the situation before it roared loudly, drawing attention to itself as it inhaled in preparation to breathe fire onto the adventurers who dared to enter its territory. It was interrupted by a loud shout before extreme pain exploded under the chin of one of its heads before everything went black. The other head was quick to look at what had happened and was shocked to see that a siren had kicked them. With Rei a moment earlier, the siren had been casually kicking in the faces and other vital body parts of the various monsters for a few minutes now, and since she rarely got the time to practice her own form of dancing due to having no one to dance with, none of the others could keep up with her, so they usually turned down her offers to dance with her after their first attempt. She decided to use the monsters as makeshift dance partners. She leaned backwards, avoiding the snapping jaws of a lizardman, before twirling her body in the air parallel to the ground and using her momentum to kick the monster in the back with enough force to snap its spine like a twig before moving on. She would twirl, twist and bend her body to evade attacks before counter-attacking with individually deadly strikes of her own. It never took her more than one strike to end the lives of her enemies. No matter how hard their bodies were or how agile they may have been, all of them fell to her attacks nonetheless. Due to the speed provided by her Devil Fruit ability and her use of both observational and armament haki, there really wasn't anything on these floors that could hold a candle to her. What made her special was her speed. All most adventurers could see was a golden blur moving between monsters before said monsters suddenly fell to the ground in droves before exploding into ashes. This was something the siren had practiced for many weeks after Kaido told them that they had to develop a fighting style of their own, to, as he called it, stand out from the rest. Unfortunately, her light speed ballet was cut short when she heard her captain yelling her name. Immediately Rei stopped playing around and activated her observational haki. Through her mind's eye she could see what was about to happen and stepped forward to stop it. She saw the Amphisbaena breathing fire over her new comrades before they could react, immediately immolating them. "Not on my watch," she said quietly as she used her Devil Fruit ability to move at the speed of light while covering her leg in armament haki before delivering a single powerful kick to the black-scaled Amphisbaena's chin. The force of the strike forced its mouth closed and sent its head and neck careening back and slamming into the ground with a loud crash that not only shook the floor but also caused the floor boss to topple over. The adventurers who had already cleared their battle areas of monsters stood in shocked silence as one of the Xenos pirates just knocked the floor boss onto its back with one kick. Now they were sure that either their captains or executives could do the same thing, but it would take them quite a bit of effort to do it. The siren made it seem like a daily chore, not a floor boss that could kill them accidentally. Just what kind of monsters have we allied ourselves with? Was the thought going through many of their minds as they returned to the present and assisted their comrades in battle. With the executives and captains, Herculea, Maxim, Althea, Zald and all the others looked on with serious expressions. They knew Althea said that they were strong, but this kind of strength seemed a bit more than even the average floor boss could hope to obtain. To Maxim and Herculea, it just proved why they needed the pirates on their side instead of against them. Althea was the first to voice her thoughts aloud. "It would appear that she has become stronger since the last time I sparred with her, isn't that right, Kaido?" The Hera Familia executive asked, even though she already knew the answer. Which didn't go over Kaido's head. Why do you ask questions you already know the answers to? He began with a question of his own which caused Althea to look away after being caught fishing for information. During her second visit to the pirates' base, Althea had requested a friendly spar with Rei to find out how much she needed to improve. The end result of this spar was a draw, given that both of them relied on their speed to get an advantage over their opponents. This evened out the battlefield and gave the image that the two of them were evenly matched in battle. Though unknown to her, Rei had been holding back because of the deadly nature of most of her light-based attacks. Adventurers need to be strong in order to protect their familias. It's the same for us and our crew. Rei sees the others as her family and will do anything to protect them. I don't think I need to say more than that. The former emperor ended his speech as the Amphisbaena began to get up from the ground. Everyone looked on in shock as the dark-scaled head dragged on the ground limply like a wet spaghetti noodle. It was clear to everyone that the siren had killed one of the Amphisbaena's heads with a single kick. While the one head was dead, the other had an expression of pure, unadulterated rage covering its features and was directed at a single monster. The golden siren who had struck without warning and killed its twin, it would be sure to make that monster suffer. The white-scaled head lunged at Rei with as much speed as it could muster with its twin being dragged behind it. Normally this would mean certain death for anyone who couldn't get out of the way in time. Unfortunately for the Amphisbaena, the golden siren it wanted to kill was also the fastest of the Xenos pirates, not including their captain. Just as the floor boss's claws were about to shred her body, Rei vanished in a flash of light. The monster Rex was successful in crushing a rock with its clawed paw. Not seeing the golden feathers scattered through the air immediately brought it back on guard, but it was too late for such an action as the siren it had been trying to kill had appeared on the ceiling of the floor above the floor boss with her wings spread wide and her legs together and slightly bent at the knees with a bright glow appearing across the length of her wings. "Farewell, Amphisbaena, may you be a comrade to us in your next life," Rei said to the monster with a sad smile before launching her finishing move, Wings of Change. She yelled as she blitzed the floor boss and severing both of the monster Rex's necks at their bases with a single pass of her wings. The adventurers who had cleared the floor of other monsters by now, watched in awe as the siren killed a floor boss with 2 moves. The first to speak up was one of the Xenos pirates, or rather one of their newer members, the Lamia. "Wow, I guess that was a thing, huh?" She stated the obvious and succeeded in lowering the tension in the room dramatically. The group sighed before deciding to take a break on the ground to regain their strength and strategize before continuing their journey to the deep floors. Break time. After carving up the body of the Amphisbaena and extracting its drop items, the expedition regrouped and Gross was called back to the ground along with all of the supporters he had protected now that the battle had ended. All of the supporters were happy to be back with their comrades even though the gargoyle had protected them and brought any injured adventurers into their safe zone to be healed. It made him seem less scary than before and actually made him one of the most liked of the Xenos pirates despite his gruff disposition. The group had sat down to take a break and refresh themselves. The adventurers were eating preserved food such as dried meat and fruits while the Xenos pirates were talking amongst themselves with a bit of input from Althea from time to time. After a little while, Maxim spoke up with a question to the pirates. "So, tell me something, Xenos pirates. What do you guys and girls do for fun? You got any hobbies or something like that?" He asked, curious about what they do in their free time. Kaido smiled before puffing out his chest. "I love to drink alcohol. With help from the guild I got to try quite a few more kinds than I was familiar with before." Ha ha ha. He laughed happily thinking about his alcohol. Zald seemed to appreciate the former emperor's love of alcohol and was thinking about challenging him to a drinking contest at a later date when they weren't on an expedition or hunting down some of the strongest monsters that resided on the surface. Althea seemed to shudder at the mention of Kaido's infamous drinking habits, still remembering their first meeting. Lyde spoke next. I like playing card games, they're fun. But my real hobby is mathematics. I needed to do my accurate mapping of each floor of the dungeon after all, and eventually I just started doing it for fun. He, the lizardman said while scratching the back of his head with an embarrassed chuckle. Hercules smiled at the strange hobby of the lizardman. I never thought I'd see the day when a lizardman would be good at math. Even on the surface the only ones that use maths are merchants, stock takers and a few gods. She said with a humorous tone. The others seemed to relax a bit more and opened up a little. Some even began asking Lyde some math questions like a group of school kids. Lyde smiled and answered their math questions without much effort. The next to speak up was Gross, and his hobby was as unexpected as Lyde's. I like to build. I was the one who constructed the Xenos pirates' bases in the dungeon. Eventually it became a hobby and I started doing it not for a purpose but for fun, he explained in his gruff tone of voice. Once again everyone was shocked by the gargoyle's admission, but having seen several shocking things today they caught themselves quickly before listening to the rest of them. From Laura's enjoyment of poetry and reading love stories, which she was very invested in, while Ranier reluctantly spoke about her love for chemistry and the improvement of the toxic compounds her poisons were made of. Some of the female members of the familias offered to share some of their literature with the Lamia if she spoke to them some more about the view she had on love. Ranier on the other hand was approached by several archers who had seen her poison arrows that killed monsters almost instantly. After a bit of negotiating with her they managed to get a sample of her dehydrating toxin, in exchange for several antidotes for her to study later. Since Gryu couldn't speak, Light explained the green dragon's favorite pastime. That being botany, or to be more specific flower growing and arranging. The adventurers were once again surprised that a terrifying creature like a dragon enjoyed arranging flowers in his free time. To prove his skills Gryu grew a beautiful bouquet of various colored flowers arranged in a wavy rainbow pattern that awed his onlookers, especially the women. All this time Rei had remained silent. She was very embarrassed by the hobbies she had taken a liking to and was trying to make herself as small as possible in the hopes that no one would notice her absence. Unfortunately though she had great skills in combat, her stealth skills were subpar in comparison, as Althea's gaze landed on her before asking aloud, "What about you Rei, what do you like to do for fun?" The executive asked aloud with the most smug expression Rei had ever seen on a human's face and knew immediately that the woman that had become a close friend of hers over the last few months was playing a prank on her. Normally she'd be mad at anyone who did something like this, but this time she just felt exasperation towards Althea for putting the spotlight on her. "Alright, Sai, I enjoy spending my free time practicing my singing and battle ballet dance," the Golden Siren explained with a sigh because she knew what was coming next. "Oh yeah, I almost forgot you can sing Rei. Why don't you sing them a song? I'm sure they'll love it," Lyde said excitedly as he encouraged his first friend. "Sai, alright, I'll sing one of my favorite songs, but only because you asked Lyde." Her words were filled with exasperation but she smiled nonetheless. All chatter from the adventurers became silent as the siren cleared her throat before beginning to hum a relatively fast tune that the adventurers were completely unfamiliar with. After a few moments she opened her mouth and began to speak a phrase Kaido had once shared with her and inspired the song she was going to sing. Her voice immediately awed all who heard it and brought a smile to the pirates who closed their eyes and enjoyed the sound of her voice to its full extent. Althea seemed shocked by the depth of the meaning behind the siren's words, and she wasn't alone. Her fellow executives were fully focused on her song as well. Hearing the words of her song, Maxim remembered what his deity Lord Zeus had said about pirates and their endless quests for treasure. Though it would appear that the Xenos pirates seemed to desire a different kind of treasure than what he expected. Instead of monetary gains and fame, they seemed to be looking for comradeship with others. At least that's what he could understand from her song so far. This was one of the reasons Kaido thought it necessary to have a musician on his crew. They could easily build the morale of their allies with a song or performance, and judging by the expressions and swaying movements of some of the adventurers as their bodies moved to the tune of her song. And to think, she wrote it after he had thought up some words of inspiration for his crew. The Golden Siren's song continued, bringing a smile and sometimes even a tear to some of her listeners, mostly those who had a dream or ambition of their own before joining a familia, but it got lost in the excitement of what they had been doing and had been completely forgotten by them. Rei's song hit them hard, especially those who hadn't found that dream that they wished to accomplish before they died. She sang a different variation of the chorus, that highlighted a very different aspect of the pirates' philosophy, their focus on bonds instead of the reliance on the god's blessing but on their love for one another. As the end of the song approached, many of the executives seemed to feel a great feeling of melancholy, both because of the end of the song and the dreams they've failed to reach. As Rei ended her song she was greeted with the sound of loud applause. This had never happened before. In response to this surge of positive responses, the Golden Siren blushed deeply before using her wings to cover her flushed face from the view of the others. The Xenos pirates, having heard her song before, simply nodded approvingly in her direction. After a moment, she regained enough emotional stability for her to stand up straight and perform a performer's bow with her right leg forward and her left bent at the knee while her right wing covered her chest while her left was extended downwards. In this stance, she lowered her head to her audience who clapped and cheered for the beautiful vocal performance. A moment later Hercules spoke up, "That was the most beautiful singing I've ever heard, truly no one on the surface can match you, Siren Ray. Regardless, we've been resting for about an hour now, I believe it's time to continue this expedition, don't you agree, Captain Kaido, Maxim?" She asked the other two leaders who simply nodded in response to her question. "Alright then, we're moving out," she said as she got up along with the rest of her own and Zeus familias and the Xenos pirates, and they made their way down to the deep floors with a great deal of excitement and nervousness in their hearts. The journey continues. 10 hours later, the expedition was currently on the 36th floor, tearing through monsters with reckless abandon. Unlike in the Water Kingdom, the monsters in the deep floors were so strong and numerous that the executives of both familias were fighting alongside their lower-ranked adventurers in bloody melee with the dungeon's offspring. Similarly, the Xenos pirates were also in full combat mode. Even Kaido had been tearing through the hordes upon hordes of monsters and sending entire groups of them flying with each swing of Hisaikai. Wild growths had begun to change the shape of the ground to resemble sharp spikes that would suddenly shoot up from the ground and impale or slow down monsters enough for the adventurers to kill them. Althea had cast Satana's variant several times already to help clear out the massive numbers of monsters moving against them, while Zald had cast his magic Ray Ambrosia to cover the entire floor behind them with intense fire to prevent any monsters from sneaking up behind them. And finally, befitting their ranks as captains of their respective familias, Herculea and Maxim were throwing around monsters like rag dolls as if the practice was going out of fashion. Likewise, the Xenos pirates were no longer playing around. Ray had been using her luminous disc to slice entire groups of monsters in half, while had finally started using his Devil Fruit ability, the Dragon Fruit, model Allosaurus, to send the hordes flying before transforming back to normal and slicing them apart with his flame-coated swords. Laura had been using her Devil Fruit ability to do sneak attacks on monsters while they were charging at the group. The most flamboyant attacker of the group was without a doubt the female Arachne. Ranye, one day having an interest in Kaido's previous world, took a look at some schematics for the weapons he could remember and fell in love with the design of them and decided to model her attacks after them. Such as right now, where she was using a large bazooka made of deadly toxins to annihilate her adversaries. The adventurers who could spare a glance at her were intrigued by the strangely shaped poison weapon she was using, but put the questions off for later when they weren't fighting for their lives in a dungeon full of monsters. After another 20 minutes of fighting, they managed to reach the entrance to the 37th floor and immediately advanced, not wanting to have this expedition lasting longer than it should. The Colosseum. The Zeus, Hera and Xenos Pirates Alliance stepped forward into one of the most dangerous areas in the known parts of the deep floors. The Colosseum on the 37th floor, a place where monsters never stopped spawning. It was also a den for abnormal monsters because in this place monsters fight one another to get stronger. That's what made it so dangerous here. Regardless, the two familias and pirate crew were not turning back just because of a dangerous battleground. As the captains and executives set foot in the battle area, all attention turned to them as every skirmishing monster stopped their fight before growling in their direction before a full-blown stampede of monsters began rushing towards them. Kaido grinned maliciously before imbuing his Kanabo with a massive amount of armament haki and swinging the spiked weapon with a grinning cry of Thunder Bagua, which sent more than 24 monsters flying through the air. Within the group were Spartoi, Skullsheep and even a few goblin generals. A moment later the entire Colosseum was embroiled in an all-out war the likes of which had never been seen before by mortal eyes. 2 hours later. To say that the battle was brutal would be an understatement. There were so many monsters to kill that it became necessary to carpet bomb the horde several times by both Ray and Althea, with Luminous Rain and Satana's variant respectively. The two had been tag-teaming the monsters with their absurd speed before they annihilated them with a carpet bombing tactic. It was because of this move that they were able to clear out the horde this quickly, or it would have taken much longer than the 2 hours it had. Many adventurers were tired beyond belief, but before the group could move on to the next floor the Colosseum began to shake and there wasn't an adventurer on the expedition who didn't know what that meant. The monster Rex Udias was spawning. The adventurers stood up, regardless of how tired they were, and held up their swords and other weapons. A giant dark-colored skeletal monster with crimson eyes rose from the center of the Colosseum before slamming its hand on the ground, causing more than 100 smaller sword or lance-wielding skeletons to be spawned. Right before the fighting could become an insanely brutal dance once again, Kaido yelled at one of his generals. "Gross. Take him, we'll cover you." He yelled, and immediately after the very ground of the Colosseum began to bulge upwards as the ground took the shape of a giant gargoyle that was even bigger than the floor boss Udias. The adventurers and even their executives looked on in awe. Every time they thought they had a hold on the abilities of the Xenos pirates, they'd pull out something like this. Even Althea seemed to be a bit surprised, but her expression could also be categorized as resigned and completely done with all this nonsense. Her expression gained a sweat drop at the words the gargoyle said in his monstrous form. "Kaiju death battle." Gross yelled as he threw a building-sized punch right at Udias' ugly face. The impact of the strike sent more than one of the floor's Spartoy warriors tumbling to the ground as the floor boss leaned back before returning the strike with just as much force, which the gargoyle blocked with one of his plaza-sized wings before returning with a slash of his claws right to the giant skeleton's face. The adventurers were snapped out of their gawking when a bright flash of light and a yell of "Lizardman slash" showed that the Spartoy warriors had recuperated and were beginning their assault. As such, they sprang into battle once more. This time the battle only took a few minutes because of the much fewer numbers of monsters. When Kaido crushed the last of the skeletons under the weight of Hisaikai, Udaya's body hit the ground without its head. To officially end the battle, the giant gargoyle pierced the monster Rex's magic crystal, killing it and causing it to turn into a massive cloud of ash. Immediately afterwards, Gross returned to his regular form and brought all of the supporters who had been kept in his safe pocket back to the surface. Without having to be told, they immediately began applying healing magic on the injured adventurers or giving them health potions. The Xenos pirates congratulated Gross on his victory, but were interrupted by the voice of their captain. "Crew, we're leaving to our base on the next floor. I believe that we all could use a break for a while." "What do you say, Herculea, Maxim?" the former emperor asked the other captains. Herculea hesitated at first before looking at the battered and exhausted-looking members of both familias. Even though the pirates did most of the work, she quickly glanced to Maxim, who just shrugged before saying, "You got any better ideas?" She shook her head before looking back to Kaido and his crew. "We accept your offer for temporary lodging. What will be the cost of our time there?" she asked, knowing that they wouldn't do anything for free. She was pleasantly surprised when Ray shook her head in the negative. "You misunderstand, Miss Herculea. The guild pays for the expenses incurred during an expedition through our territory. Besides, we're friends now, aren't we?" The executives scrutinized her for any traces of dishonesty, but after a while they could find none and shrugged in their captain's direction. Herculea sighed before nodding. "Very well, please lead the way," she said, not knowing the future implications of her decision. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is it wrong for a Yonko to reincarnate as a Xenos in the dungeon by Hakamaster 38 inches. Chapter 9. Expedition Part 2, Beef. After the defeat of Udaya's, and despite the expedition diving to a lower floor, defeating the monsters seemed rather easy in comparison to the hell they fought before. Unlike before though, it was Kaido leading the way because neither of the surface familias knew where the Xenos pirates' base on the 38th floor was. To be fair, they only really knew about the base on the 21st floor where they had joined up with the pirates today. So once the agreement was made, Kaido took the lead and sent the poor foolish monsters back to their mother with righteous prejudice as they came charging at him. The adventurers followed behind and killed any stragglers that the former emperor missed. Within an hour the group was on the next floor, and were soon led to an area that had never been seen by the adventurers from the surface. Despite the beautiful lush plant life in this unexplored area of the dungeon, Althea and Zald couldn't help but feel uncomfortable, and they weren't the only ones. Althea, being the closest human to the Xenos pirates, decided to voice her concerns about her strange feelings from being in this area. "Hey Ray, what's with this place? It gives me the creeps," she asked the pirate vice captain, something she knew was going through the minds of the others as well. Ray responded to her friend's inquiry without much pause. She knew what was going on after all and decided to explain some of it to the others after getting an affirmative nod from her captain. "You see, this part of the floor's forest is not natural. Ryu is the one who made it. It serves both as defense for the base and a way to monitor anyone or anything that gets too close," she began her explanation to the others. "The trees purposefully invoke a strong feeling of paranoia and make those within want to leave its confines as quickly as possible. It's why we call it our passive defense measure," the siren continued with her explanation. "Although, that doesn't mean it's harmless. It can come to life and kill anything it deems a threat and use their bodies as fertilizer," she ended with a menacing look on her face. Althea seemed to look around her suspiciously before muttering to herself, "I was wondering why I couldn't find the one who was watching me so intensely," she said. Chuckle Ray laughed lightly at what Althea said. "Yes, the trees themselves are observing all of us, but not only us, but every speck of dust is also under its scrutiny. As I said before, its purpose is to be the first line of defense against invaders," she ended her explanation to the Zeus and Hera familias. This explanation alleviated some of their unease, if only a little. Just because Ray explained what was going on didn't stop the trees from watching them after all. A few minutes later they reached the end of the gazing forest, as the pirates called it, and entered a large cave that was sealed off by a large blue crystal. The adventurers were relieved to finally be out of the forest and finally get some rest. Little did they know the Xenos pirates' base had another unorthodox defense mechanism that would leave many of them with a headache every time they even thought about it. Xenos pirates' base, vodka. When the entire group of adventurers had entered the cave, Ray had spread her wings wide before saying, "Welcome Zeus and Hera familias to the Xenos pirates' secret base, vodka. You will probably be the only people to actually enter one of our bases for a long while still, hee hee hee." She giggled at the end as she saw the expressions on the faces of several of the expedition members. The first to speak up was Zald. I don't mean to be rude, but I can see why you'd call this base vodka. I feel buzzed just looking at it, he said, rather confused by what exactly he and the rest were actually looking at. Honestly, I'm not sure if I want to know more about this place, but seriously, what happened to these caves? Althea voiced her confusion on the matter. The design of the area in front of the groups was somewhere between a residential complex, a cave, and a drunk architect who realized that he hated right angles almost as much as he hated the hangover after binging. All of the buildings were connected to every other building, in some way or another, while not a single one of them was straight up, each tilted at some obscene angle that made the whole thing uncomfortable to look at for the adventurers. Ray just laughed lightly at her friend's confusion. Well, you see, this is just the entrance to the base, not the base itself. Gross built this base, but he didn't want to make it like all the others, and since he was running out of ideas that Kaido usually provided from his memories, he decided to try something new. She began her explanation as the adventurers who slowly began to approach the base. The entrance to the base itself truly fit the description of the crew, that being, Xenos. All of the structures were so strangely shaped and tilted at bizarre angles that made some of the adventurers dizzy just looking at it. As the group made their way through the entrance led by Kaido, many of them looked on in confused awe at the collection of strangely shaped buildings. Wow, vertigo! One of the level 4s exclaimed as the path they were walking through suddenly went sideways. Maxim was pretty sure that he saw the glowing roof of the cave to his left at some point. Ray, sensing one of the adventurers about to wander off, suddenly stopped before speaking. Everyone, please try to focus on the back of the person in front of you. This part of the base is designed to confuse invaders and induce confusion. Please be careful. The siren's words caused a few murmurs from the adventurers, however it was Herculea who spoke up with the question they were all thinking. Tell me something, Ray. How exactly did you guys make a place like this, and more importantly, how are you not confused or getting lost in this madhouse? She asked as the bizarre surroundings began to make even her feel slightly dizzy. Gross spoke up to answer her question this time. I designed this place to be the second line of defense for this base if an invader managed to get past Ryu's forest. As for why we don't feel disoriented by it, well, there's only one safe path through this place, and it's the one we've memorized and are currently on. The gargoyle ended his explanation as the group finally left the Cavern of Madness and found a relatively normal-looking settlement on the other side. What he didn't tell them was that one of Ryu's dungeon sapping trees went through the only safe path in this trap. All the Xenos pirates needed to do was follow it with their haki, and they'd always find their way out of their own traps. The adventurers didn't need to know that yet, so the words of the two Xenos was enough without revealing too much information. Ray laughed lightly as a memory of the defense's design came back to her. Hey everyone, you should have seen Lyde's face when Gross showed us the designs for this trap. It was hilarious. They looked so confused by it, it was almost like they were drunk. Ha ha ha, the siren said as her light laughs became full-chested laughter. The adventurers looked surprised but soon joined the golden siren in her glorious golden giggles. Ha! Finally, something normal, Maxim exclaimed as the group made their way out of the defense trap that makes both adventurers and monsters fall to confusion and insanity, with the two captains making sure that everyone was accounted for before leading them to the base. Kaido had stopped before the relatively large building complex in the back, before turning around and beginning to speak. Listen up everyone, this area is a safe zone where no monsters spawn. But a word of warning, this is still the dungeon. If someone does something stupid and summons a juggernaut, then I suppose you would be the ones to deal with it, the former emperor said with a glare that caused more than one of the adventurers to nod nervously. Maxim and Herculea nodded in response, and with that Kaido, Ray, Lyde, Gross, Laura, Ranye and Ryu led the way for the adventurers, who separated themselves into 4 groups. Firstly into their separate familias and then by men and women. With that said and done, the Xenos pirates and the executives and captains sat down in the largest building in the base for a meeting about the next day's dive. Meeting. Alright, before we get some sleep, let's make our plan for tomorrow, Herculea began as all the others sat just like her in a large circle preparing to discuss what would be happening tomorrow. Before anyone could say anything else, Kaido removed several large red saucers from a cabinet behind him and placed one in front of each of them. The former emperor then motioned for Ryu, who nodded in response. To the shock of the executives, long vine-like pipes extended from the ceiling, before depositing a clear liquid into each of the saucers until they were full, then immediately retreating back into the ceiling. Now then, let's discuss tomorrow, Kaido said as he picked up his saucer and began drinking, with the Xenos pirates following his example. Herculea and Maxim were cautious but decided to drink nonetheless to show respect. Wow, this sake is actually pretty good. Maxim and Zald thought to themselves, even though the latter would have preferred ale instead of sake, he enjoyed it nonetheless. Althea, being used to it, drank without reservation that others expected of her. Seeing their confused gazes, she spoke up. What? You get used to it after spending enough time with these guys, the level 7 defended herself. The others shrugged before drinking from their own saucers and began listening and putting their own thoughts on the strategies put forth by the others while looking over the detailed maps of the next 20 floors. An hour and a half later, the meeting ended with everyone agreeing to go with the formation decided upon in the meeting, with many retiring for the night. With the exception of Zald and Althea, who remained with the Xenos pirates. The first to speak after the others left was Ranye. "Alright, I can understand why Althea decided to stay, but I can't comprehend why you'd stay here, Zald," she said, confused by what the level 7 swordsman wanted with them. In response to her question, Althea sighed. Zald simply responded with a chuckle. He, well, you see. I like you guys. Someone who drinks in the middle of a meeting with executives is someone I can trust. So what do you say? Why don't we have a little drinking game? As a sign of comradeship, he offered the others. Ray was about to refuse the offer, but Kaido and Lied cheered and were all for it. Sure, let's go. The two pirates said respectively. Ryu immediately released the sake into the saucers before each of them, and so began the duel of the drinks, that lasted deep into the night and resulted in a rather comical scene in the morning that confused most of the expedition when they saw it. The next morning, the two familias looked on in shock at their allies from the dungeon. Ray, Lied, Ranye and Laura were glaring angrily at Zald, who likewise was glaring at Kaido, who was speaking with Herculea and Maxim with a grin. The captain seemed to be exasperated at what had happened the night before. The only one who hadn't taken part in the impromptu drinking game was Gross and Ryu, who took their jobs too seriously to mess around like the others had. The thing that got everyone's attention was the words written on the heads of the 4 pirates and one Zeus Familia executive. On their foreheads in black was written the word, beef. This was something Zald always did to the people he defeated in a drinking contest. The only difference this time was that he'd been defeated by Kaido after defeating the 4 Xenos pirates in their little drinking game. The captain of the Hera Familia groaned heavily. Althea, why didn't you try to stop them? This could complicate things greatly, she asked her executive seriously. In response, Althea just shrugged. Do you really think I could have stopped them? The level 7 executive said with a sigh of her own as the others looked on with concern. Eventually Althea spoke up again. It doesn't matter, they've mostly worked through the alcohol in their systems. Fighting the monsters in the dungeon should sober them up, she said seriously, to which the captains just nodded in response, and this time being led by Ray down a different path. It was only with their incredible willpower that the Xenos weren't cringing in pain from the after effects of their late-night drinking game and focused only on what needed to be done. Ray used her observational haki to lead them through a shortcut out of their base. Unfortunately, it could not be used as an entrance to the base because of the way Ryu had grown the plant life to make it easy to leave but almost impossible to enter from that side. Althea had asked why they hadn't used this shortcut to get to the base instead of going through the gargoyle's madhouse. This time Kaido explained their reasoning, which after looking back at the shortcut from the outside decided that it was the better option after all. As if on cue, when the last adventurer stepped out of the safe route, the dungeon came to life with hordes of monsters. Back to the daily grind, most of them thought to themselves. Back to the expedition. The group made their way down the floors of the dungeon. The adventurers killed anything that got too close to them without any mercy, as did their executives and captains. They were however more weary of a certain group of monsters, said monsters being the Xenos pirates. Especially the ones who had the words, beef, written on their foreheads. The reason for this was the rather bloodthirsty methods they were using as they killed the monsters around them. Laura and Ray gouged out the eyes of the monsters who attacked them before ripping them apart with the claws on their hands and feet respectively. The two pirates seemed truly and totally beside themselves with rage. Ranye and Light on the other hand were not cutting but bashing and crushing everything that came too close with their swords or poison-covered mace in the case of the Arachne. The 4 were taking their frustrations out on the monsters after their humiliating defeat at the hands of Zald in last night's drinking game. They were stronger than that, weren't they? Kaido had chosen them after all, so they should have been able to defeat him. Zald also seemed to be a bit salty about his defeat at the hands of Kaido, though he didn't let it show as he slashed through the monsters like the world's most powerful weed whacker. Althea and the other executives looked exasperated at the childish behavior of the group. We're in the middle of the dungeon, keep your cool guys, she said while slashing apart a Lugaro that tried to slash at her. Ray heard her and responded while brutally killing a lizardman elite by placing one of her feet on the monster's shoulder and the other to grip its head before literally ripping the head and spinal column out of the monster's body with a quick upwards jerk of her leg. We are keeping our cool, what could possibly have given you a different idea? She asked curiously as the body burst into ashes as she plunged her clawed feet forwards again to gore another unfortunate monster. Those who saw her action felt disgusted by what the monster did but didn't have time to speak aloud because of the hordes attacking them. The pirates, executives and captains were at the front of the formation because as the group dived through the deep floors, the stronger monsters would be in front of them while the weaker ones would be behind them. When they returned to the upper floors, the formation would switch with the weaker members at the front and the stronger members at the rear, because unlike before, the stronger monsters would be behind them while the weaker ones in front of them. So for now the rear was made up mostly of level 4s and 5s while the left and right flanks were made up mostly of level 6s with level 7 executives and higher at the front of the group. With this formation the expedition tore their way through the dungeon's deep floors. Many of the adventurers ended up killing monsters they've never seen before and thus adding to their status, but something that truly made this expedition different from the others was the fact that their supporters didn't need to be protected because of gross ability. So adventurers and mages were free to fight without distractions. Several hours later, the Hera, Zeus and Xenos alliance were killing everything that got in their way. According to Kaido, they had another base on the 50th floor that they could reach to rest once again before going further. With that in mind, the group moved as quickly as they could in the hopes of reaching the safe zone on the 50th floor to get a break before diving further. After many hours of struggle, they reached the 49th floor, and the moment the party entered the floor they were on guard. There were no monsters, there was no sound other than their own breathing and the crunching of their shoes, until a repeated heavy thumping noise began to approach the group. Monster Rex Balleur, Kaido, Herculea and Maxim watched as the giant sentient suit of rusted crimson armor walked out of a side tunnel. Its menacing crimson eyes gazed down at the foolish invaders who dared to enter its territory. After a moment, the floor boss stood facing the group in the center of the room, and then it began. Balleur seemed to have unsheathed a large sword made of bone. This floor boss was one of the few known floor bosses that was able to use a weapon, the other being Udias, but only when it was being soloed. Balleur was different in that it always wielded its weapon regardless of how many opponents it had to face. As if on cue, the walls of the boss room came alive with weapon-wielding foamwars, burning hot flame rocks and several other deep floor monsters that attacked the surface dwellers invading their territories. Sigh with a sigh and a battle cry, the assault on the warrior Balleur began. The adventurers slashed, stabbed and bludgeoned every monster that got close. The Xenos pirates were doing the same thing, but in a more brutal fashion, a much more brutal fashion. Had the supporters not been hidden underground by gross devil fruit ability, they'd probably be blowing chunks at the site of the battlefield. It was not missed by anyone that took a moment to look, but the group of allied monsters were very upset. Most believed it was because of what Zald had done, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The real reason for their displeasure was losing to someone from the surface. They had been trained by Kaido, the former Emperor of the Sea. They had killed floor bosses solo and even dived deeper than the two strongest familias together. So why did they taste defeat at the hands of a dangerously delicious fruity alcoholic drink and not a great battle like the ones their captain spoke of? It wasn't Zald's fault. They were upset about their own weakness that allowed a mere 5 gallons of sake to conquer them. The only consolation the group managed to get was that Captain Kaido had avenged their humiliating defeat by drinking all the alcohol left in the base before beefing Sir Zald. Thankfully, the group found that viciously mutilating the monsters of the deep floors made them feel better. Meanwhile, Kaido had been casually standing in the same spot as Herculea and Maxim performed a 2-on-1 assault on Balleur. Kaido would admit that they were pretty good. If they learned how to use haki, they might have been a real challenge to his old commanders Queen and Jack. He doubted they would truly challenge King in battle though. A Fomor tried to impale him with its horns but broke the pair of natural weapons for its trouble before being crushed by Hasaikai. This was boring, was the thought going through Kaido's head as he saw the adventurers beginning to overwhelm the monsters and would soon step forward to help their captains just like the executives were already doing. Damn it, can't we just skip the boring floors and get to the real fights? He said with a sigh while swatting a foolish monster who thought it could hurt him. As he looked to the side, he saw a rather bizarre sight. Ranye had trapped several monsters in a giant web, but that wasn't the bizarre part. The monsters were wrapped in the entrails of other monsters that were still alive and occupying the central parts of the web, while Ray, Light and Laura eviscerated monsters while keeping them alive and adding them to the macabre spiderweb. I'm amazed the monsters are still alive after going through the Xenos blender like that, but why does this picture piss me off? The former emperor thought to himself, unconsciously comparing their precision in the art of evisceration to the power of that surgeon from the worst generation that was able to bypass his defenses with his devil fruit ability and not his haki. What an annoying fighter. Regardless of that, Kaido began to approach his crew members to put a stop to what he considered to be a rather big waste of time, despite the fact that they could become good doctors by practicing whatever this was. As he approached, a loud roar echoed through the floor as the floor boss broke free from its battle with the captains and executives of the two familias. With its sword in hand, it charged at Kaido with an unexpected burst of speed. It had seen this single invader standing in the middle of its battlefield and it dared to not fight at all. The floor boss wouldn't accept such disrespect and quickly broke free from the ones fighting it and charged at the disrespectful cretin who dared come here without any intention of fighting to its last breath. The adventurers looked on as the almost 25-foot-tall floor boss raised its sword over its head before bringing it down. Althea and Zald were about to blitz the floor boss, but were stopped by their captains who shook their heads. Maxim and I want to see how strong he really is, Herculea said as the others looked on with Althea and Zald lowering their weapons. The Xenos pirates, hearing the roar of the floor boss, turned to see it charging their captain, and there was only one thought going through their minds at the turn of events. Oh well, I guess the fun is over then, they thought as the group had mostly worked their self-loathing out of their systems and were preparing to detonate their artwork for artistic effect before moving to the next floor. Kaido just stood still as the monster Rex's sword came down on him. The emperor quickly covered his kanabo with a layer of haki before raising it at the last moment and blocking Balor's two-handed swing with one arm. The adventurers were shocked before their shock transformed into awe as the former emperor flexed the muscles in his arm and sent the giant floor boss stumbling back with its sword sent flying out of its hands. Before the floor boss could regain its balance or even think about striking back at the incredibly strong invader, its head was knocked clean off its shoulders with a loud cry of thunder bagua. The floor boss was dead before its lifeless body had hit the ground. Never before had dungeon armor been so ineffective as it was right now. The executives and captains looked on grimly, now realizing the true power of the Xenos pirates. A moment later, the massive three-dimensional spiderweb made out of monster parts burst into flames almost as though it was some macabre fireworks show to celebrate the death of Balur as the floor boss's followers burned at the stake in front of his corpse. Well, that was anticlimactic. I feel as though that's going to be a repeating theme during this expedition. Ray said with a soft smile. So, are the four of you done throwing your little temper tantrum? Kaido asked while looking to his crew with a serious gaze. Of course, Captain, we're all better now. We just needed to let off some steam, that's all. Right, guys, she explained before asking for support from her fellow crew members and only got nods or grunts from her crew. The siren seemed to become annoyed with the weak response she got from her crew and was about to question them again when Kaido spoke up. Well, that's good then, let's go get some sleep at Onigashima before continuing down, he said, to which the captains nodded and motioned for the supporters to get the floor boss's drop item, which was done after only a few minutes, allowing the expedition to get to the next floor in a timely manner. Xenos Pirates Main Base, Onigashima. Upon arrival to the Xenos Pirates main base after passing some serious defense mechanisms, the two familias looked on in shock but mostly weariness at the design of what could only be called a fortress. The Xenos Pirates main base, appropriately named Onigashima, was a recreation of Kaido's previous home in Wano. Though unlike the original Onigashima, this one wasn't made from the skull of a giant that was slayed in the past. You know, for some reason the look of your base doesn't surprise me at all. Althea said with a blank expression on her face. Ray giggled nervously. Well, you see, Kaido wanted it this way, we didn't really have any choice in the matter. I assure you though, it's much more appealing on the inside, he. The siren's words didn't seem to lift their spirits in any way. They followed her nonetheless and were shocked by the interior. What the hell? It looks like a cemetery from the outside but a far eastern castle on the inside. Our mansions aren't this fancy, was the thought running through everyone's mind. Even Althea's normal blank poker face couldn't be maintained as she looked at what was going on in front of her right now. Just how much have they been trading with the guild over the past few months to be able to afford this much luxury? Althea thought to herself seriously as she made eye contact with her captain, who just shrugged in response. Well, it didn't matter, they were here to rest for a while before continuing down to the deep floors of the dungeon tomorrow. The plan was to get to the 80th floor. This floor was decided because the Xenos pirates had reached the 75th floor on their own without help, and with them here they should be able to make it much deeper in the next few days. It was a well-known fact that the journey down was usually much shorter than the trek up to the surface. Suddenly a thought crossed Althea's mind as the women of the two familias were led to the female bathing area of the castle, while the men were led to a hot waterfall that the Xenos pirates used as a shower to clean themselves before dinner when everyone would reunite before going to bed. Tell me something, Ray, why were you and the others so upset earlier? She asked the siren with a curious gaze. The vice captain of the Xenos pirates sighed with a blush on her face before answering her friend's question. Well, I'm pretty sure you know that we lost the drinking competition to Sir Zald, and having our captain save our dignity by defeating the adversary that we were unable to overcome, well, it left us angry with ourselves, she said, embarrassed by the reason for their actions during the dive. But it's in the past now, we're over it and the frustration had been taken out on the dungeon, so don't worry about it anymore, okay? She ended and Althea simply nodded while her thoughts drifted over the siren's words. So they weren't upset at Zald, they were angry at themselves for losing. Althea thought to herself with a strange feeling bubbling inside of her. An almost sisterly feeling of wanting to do something for someone else but failing each time. Mituria, they're just like us, she muttered softly. Only Ray heard her but didn't seem to react in any observable way. Chapter 10, The Stuff of Legends. For Maxim, the captain of the Zeus Familia, it was necessary to get used to strange and unexplainable occurrences, especially when said occurrences happened within the depths of the dungeon. The red-haired warrior had been through many adventures. The level 8 status sheet was more than enough proof of that, but even all of his experiences couldn't prepare him for what was happening in front of him right now. Had he told this story to anyone on the surface without adequate proof, he'd probably be sent to have his head checked, along with everyone else on the floor right now fighting like mad men and women as literal thousands of monsters poured from the walls with murder in their eyes. But how did it come to be like this? How did things go so wrong as well as so right? He, alongside Herculea, the executives of both familias and all of the lower-ranked adventurers, were currently doing their absolute best to thin the numbers of the monsters without much success, while the Xenos pirates were absolutely wrecking the dungeon with their unrestrained attacks and unintentionally birthing several juggernauts who were killed before they could even leave the walls. Kaido had transformed into a several hundred-meter-long azure dragon that was firing off dozens of incredibly destructive fire breath attacks and erasing hundreds of monsters at a time before twisting his body and creating powerful winds that made it easier for the adventurers to kill the off-balance monsters or even having said monsters ripped from the ground before being fatally slammed into it again. Before, the captains and executives would have reprimanded them for what would undoubtedly make things much worse, but they no longer cared anymore because as it was discovered almost 20 floors above it was impossible to fight on these floors without spawning at least 4 juggernauts at least once every hour, and unlike the middle and lower floors, the monsters down here never stopped spawning. And this floor in particular was a floor unlike any other. The reason for this was the fact that every monster from every floor before, including at least 3 of every previous floor boss, spawned at least once every hour. They had been here for 4 hours and the madness of the non-stop battle had yet to slow down even a little. This was not unexpected though. The expedition was currently on the 99th floor and were slowly but surely making their way to the stairs to the 100th floor. This journey was full of uncertainties, but one thing that was absolutely certain about this expedition. This dive would go down in the history books as the day the dungeon was conquered. Now this is a tale destined for the dungeon oratoria. Flashback, floor 51 to 69. After a rejuvenating bath in the castle of Onigashima followed by a good night's sleep and a very filling breakfast, all of the adventurers armored themselves up, popped their joints and began their march to the depths. These were the deep floors. The number of breaks would be few and far between as they descended. Kaido had made it clear that the bases they had below this one could not accommodate all of them. So the number of chances to rest would be limited. With that in mind, the leaders decided to make the dive from the base on the 50th floor all the way to the 69th floor. With that in mind, the expedition split in two, with the captains, several executives and the 5 leaders of the Xenos pirates making up the front and spearhead of the expedition. While 2 executives, the remaining 2 Xenos pirates and the lower-ranking members of both familias who were in charge of cleanup after the spearhead of the formation had cleared the path for them. This formation could only be maintained until the 52nd floor, however, due to a Valgong dragon on the 58th floor sending a fire breath attack upwards that destroyed their way to the lower floors. It was no problem though, the dragon just made their way down much faster. Now, without having to use the stairs, the entire expedition dived down through the hole the dragon had created and proceeded to literally skip 6 floors before storming the bottom of the dragon's vase, where they killed several dragons on their way down. Many of the lower-ranked members were allowed to ride gusts of wind created by Rei and Ryu. The level 4s and supporters were brought to the new site of battle by Gross creating an earth bubble from the dungeon and literally having the entire group falling through the floors like a brown sphere going through a sheet of paper from the perspective of the monsters they passed on the way down. By the time they managed to reorient themselves, the floor had already been cleared by the executives who went ahead. Immediately the supporters followed the rest in their little dungeon bubble, while offering their support in the form of healing potions for injured adventurers or mind potions for mages on the verge of a mind down, and from time to time firing off an arrow or magic spell to assassinate any monsters who could potentially kill one of their comrades. The formation that was utilized as the group descended remained the same spearhead formation they began with on the 50th floor, with the executives and captains at the front of the group, with the level 6s and 5s occupying the flanks in an alternating pattern and the lower-ranked adventurers in the rear of the group to kill anything that might try to sneak up on them. There was no need for them to change formation on these floors because it was a well-known fact that there was no floor boss within the dragon vase, even though some monsters could be confused for floor bosses because of how strong they were or how difficult it was to kill them with regular means of combat. Speaking of combat, the group at the front were tearing through the opposition like a sword through wet paper. Althea was using her incredible speed and skills with her short sword to slice and dice the monsters foolish enough to stand against her. An observer might have likened her movements to that of a dance with blades instead of a dance partner. Zald and the other executives were also turning the battlefield into a bloodbath for their enemies with swords, spears and maces. With the battles being as chaotic as this, a few adventurers were bound to slip up, and unfortunately this had happened several times already. Most of the time resulting in relatively serious injuries, but fortunately no deaths as of yet, mostly because of Gross and the supporters pulling injured adventurers underground and having them healed with magic or potions. It worked very well so far, but the pirate knew that it wouldn't last. As the group descended past the 59th floor killing everything in their path, Rei spoke up and asked her friend something that had been on her mind since their talk the previous night. Hey Althea, if all of the different types of familias have the same goal, then why do they separate themselves from one another instead of working together? She asked curiously as she kicked a charging dragon's head and neck, clean off its shoulders. Althea looked at the siren who she had come to call a friend over the past few months with a small glare for starting a conversation in the middle of the dungeon while they were fighting, even if she knew that she and the others were skilled enough to do both without much effort. Sigh, I've already explained this last night, it's because of the individual patron deities of each familia, she responded before intoning her quick chant attack magic. Needless to say, the monsters attacking her were eviscerated by the magic before their magic stones fell to the ground, where they were left for the supporters to pick up as they passed. Now the reason Ray asked her question about the familias on the surface was because Althea had explained to them during dinner the previous night about the kinds of familias that were within Orario. Flashback. The two familias were enjoying their dinner of dungeon fruits and some meat and vegetables, courtesy of the guild and masterfully cooked by their resident mathematician, light and deadly chemist Ranye. Despite the latter's specialty being poisoning things, her cooking skills were good enough to even gain praise from Zald, who despite being able to eat anything because of his skill, was a very picky eater. The conversation in the dining room was jovial as the adventurers and Xenos pirates enjoyed their food. Suddenly Ray had a thought that had been plaguing her mind for a while now. Whenever she saw adventurers in the dungeon, they always remained within their groups and never really interacted with other familias even if they encountered one another on their dives. "Hey Althea, could you tell me a little about the different familias please?" She asked her first friend from the surface. Said friend looked at her a bit exasperatedly because most of the time when the two spoke it was about the surface and what happens there. It wasn't surprising given that Ray had no reference to it other than her. Even so, it did become grating at times, so the level 7 executive decided to answer but as vaguely as possible. Alright, well the familias of Orario can be divided into categories based on what they do. For example the exploration type familias such as the two surface groups here in our rivals Loki and Freya familias respectively. We explore the dungeon in search of adventure, wealth and fame that forms the basis of our escapades within its depths, she explained like a patient teacher explaining something to a rebellious student. Next are the production type familias, as the name implies they produce products that others use such as weapons, armor or medicine. They are a very important part of the society because they make our weapons and produce our medicine. Examples of these would be the Hephaestus and Myak familias. She paused to take a drink from her mug before continuing her explanation. Next would be the entertainment type familias, and as you can guess they entertain the people of Orario with shows or other means. Examples of these would be the Ishtar and Ganesha familias. Though the latter also does dungeon exploration. She paused, a disgusted look passed over her face. She quickly regained her calm and collected expression as she began the end of her explanation. The last would be the exiled familias who as the name suggests were exiled from Orario for crimes against the people, Osiris and Ares familias to name a few. Althea ended her explanation. Suddenly another thought crossed her mind, but that doesn't mean the members of these familias are restricted to these roles. They can do anything they want so long as their groups approve. Althea quickly added on the end. It was basic knowledge about the surface by now, but the Xenos pirates still found it odd that gods who sealed away their own power would have such an influence on the people on the surface without the actual strength to back up their authority. The explanation of the level 7 executive left Ray and the other Xenos pirates contemplating the surface and its ways, once again. Flashback end. That's kind of sad, that they don't have the freedom to associate themselves with others who their deities don't approve of or gave permission to work with. I mean Kaido doesn't care who we associate with, as long as we remember that the well-being of our crew comes first. Ray thought to herself after joining the response Althea had given her to the information given the previous night during dinner. Quickly shaking her head, the siren brought her focus back to the situation at hand. Namely the Elder Dragon horde on Kaido's birth floor. Herculea, Maxim, leave the dragons to me, I'll catch up in a minute. Kaido yelled as he transformed into his full Azure Dragon form and fired off a massive blast breath that suddenly dropped the number of dragons by a quarter. It was clear to everyone that this wouldn't take long at all. With that in mind the expedition dived deeper, knowing that the pirate captain would join them soon. However, a rather annoying detail of the floors below the 60th, for some at least, was the fact that every monster they faced was reptilian in one way or another, and they didn't stop despite annoyance some of the adventurers were currently experiencing. One of the level 6s suddenly yelled out while decapitating one of the frilled lizards with his sword, "What the hell is with all these damn lizards? I swear if another lizard suddenly shows up that's as far as he got because Kaido suddenly burst through the ceiling and landed with a crash that killed several dozen monsters unintentionally. Did ya miss me? Woro," he yelled with his unique jovial laugh, unknowingly causing several others to pale drastically. Before Kaido returned to the group, Light got a few glares when he transformed into his full Allosaurus form to take down one of the elder dragons that had spawned from the ceiling and was about to breathe fire down on his group. He didn't understand the reason for the sudden hostility but was grateful when the annoyance disappeared as Kaido rejoined the group in his hybrid dragon form. As soon as the adventurers saw him they immediately returned their focus to their battles. I wonder what was up with them, meh. It must be a surface thing, the lizardman thought to himself as the group continued to descend deeper and deeper into the dungeon. Though they had a bit of trouble with the floor boss of the 69th floor, mainly because of the ridiculous number of additional monsters the dungeon decided to spawn. The floor itself could only be described as a molten mountainous region. There were sharp rocks jutting out of the ground and walls in front of the expedition with several pools of lava scattered around the floor in random locations. This meant that the light in the room came both from the crystals above and the lava pools below. For one reason or another, the floor boss, which just so happened to be a giant red-scaled dragon with long silver claws on its feet and sharp spines on its back and a pair of yellow slitted eyes, seemed to be content with watching the adventurers fight the more numerous monsters on his floor. This disrespect for the challengers of the dungeon would not stand so long as Kaido had something to say about it. Kaido's rage got to the point where he just ordered the carpet bombing of the entire floor with their most powerful wide-ranged attacks. Kaido's Dragon Twister, Slicing Wind combined seamlessly with Lide's Allosaurus Roar and raised Luminous Rain. The adventurers just looked on in shocked awe as three of the leaders of the Xenos pirates cleared the entire room, allowing them free access to the floor boss. Dragon Twister, Slicing Wind was a technique in which Kaido in his true dragon form twisted his body with enough force to create several powerful tornadoes that could rip opponents off their feet and into the air, where the Azure Dragon would then roar crescent-shaped blades of wind that could even slice through the hardest of metals that were not coated in enough hockey. Needless to say, the monsters caught in the attack didn't live long. Allosaurus Roar was Lide's most powerful wide-ranged attack. It incorporated the Lizardman's rare ability to breathe fire with the incredible lung capacity of his full Allosaurus form to unleash a literal tsunami of flames at his opponents. In this case, when the attack was combined with his captain's wind-based attack, it turned the tornadoes into fire whirls that emulated the monsters caught in them. Finally raised Luminous Rain, an attack that literally converted the mass of any object it was based on into pure energy before releasing said energy in the form of a laser of pure electromagnetic death. The attack rained down from the ceiling and tore right through any monsters that had survived the wind blades and fire whirls. If any adventurers took the time to look up, they'd see the ceiling of the boss room was full of perfectly circular holes like that of a rice strainer. Unfortunately though, the overwhelming numbers of monsters had been replaced by 5 juggernauts that burst from the walls as the dungeon shook in response to Rei's indiscriminate attack. The executives and pirates immediately leapt into battle with the special monsters, knowing full well that the lower-ranked adventurers wouldn't be able to deal with these kinds of monsters, especially ones born on these floors. Here we go again, the Xenos pirates thought as they alongside the executives began their battle with the juggernauts, while Kaido, Maxim and Herculea went to fight the floor boss, Monster Rex Igneal, so that the group could proceed to the next floors. With Kaido, Maxim and Herculea. Even though Kaido had killed this dragon before, he had gotten some unwanted help from Rei the last time, despite how unintentional it was on her part. Apparently she had attempted to blind the monsters surrounding her, but also ended up drawing the attention of the floor boss, which allowed Kaido to kill it while it was distracted. Knowing this, the former emperor let her off with a stern warning about not interfering in his fights. Now was not the time to reminisce about the past, even if he wouldn't be fighting it solo as he'd hoped, mostly because the floor boss had suddenly enveloped its entire body in flames in preparation for battle. Captain Kaido, what can you tell us about this floor boss? Our familias have never fought it before, so any information would be greatly appreciated, the brunette level 9 adventurer asked, with her rapier and parrying dagger in her right and left hand respectively. Maxim kept his eyes fixed on the crimson-winged dragon as he listened to the words of the pirate captain. It's much faster than any of the floor bosses before, while being relatively resistant to most magical attacks, except for fire-based ones that actually strengthen it. Physical attacks work well enough though, the former emperor explained as he took a step forward. Just before their battle began, he added quickly, oh yeah, it can also make fire from any part of its body. So be careful when you attack, if you get too close it will take advantage of you. That was unfortunately as far as he got, because the wingless dragon had suddenly emitted a powerful burst of fire from the bottom of its hind paws and flew, like a bullet, towards its targets. Let's have some fun, shall we? Kaido thought to himself as he began twirling Hasaikai in his hand with muted excitement. With the executives and pirates, unlike the captains, they didn't have the luxury of time to strategize because of the speed of their opponents. Althea and Zald disappeared almost instantly, with their fellow executives following a moment later. Similarly, the Xenos pirates commanders Rei, Light and Ryu seemed to vanish. There was a beat and then there was chaos. Sparks flew through the air, gusts of wind sent several lower-ranked adventurers to the ground as shockwaves shook the floor. All of the combatants were almost invisible to the level 4s, while the level 5s were only able to see glimpses of the position of any of them. The level 6s were able to see what was happening clearly, but had no hope of being anything more than a hindrance in the battle unfolding before them. A moment later the fighting became so intense that Gross was forced to pull the lower-ranked adventurers underground with the supporters to stop them from becoming collateral damage. Rei's perspective. Well, it had begun happening a bit later than when the Xenos pirates had dived to the depths on their own, but the juggernauts rapidly spawning was still a problem that this group had to get used to, because further down it would be impossible not to summon them almost every 10 minutes or so. Right now though, she was enjoying having to fight only one of them, while it lasted. The golden siren jumped while twirling her body to her right to evade a lightning-fast slash from one of the juggernauts she had spawned, before delivering a light speed kick to the elbow joint of its attacking arm and subsequently breaking it at the joint. The special monster roared in pain and was about to retaliate with another slash of the claws on its other arm, but unlike before where Rei dodged it, this time she met its attack head-on. covering her wings with armament haki and concealing the armament by shrouding her wings in light. All of this happened in the millisecond before the Juggernaut's claws gutted her, and a moment later the two of them began trading blows, but given that the Xenos pirate had all of her limbs, she immediately took the lead in the battle and scored several significantly deep wounds on its body. After what felt like several minutes, but was in fact just under 25 seconds, all 5 Juggernauts were on the ground dead before turning to ashes. Wow, that was fun, right guys? Let's do it again. Ray exclaimed excitedly after the short-lived battle, but was interrupted by Light, who waved her off. Maybe later, let's get patched up before going deeper. Kaido should be done by now, he said. Ray just giggled lightly after seeing the annoyed glares of the other executives. There were 5 from the Hera Familia and 6 from the Zeus Familia, though the Xenos pirates only knew 2 of them very well, that being Althea and Zald. The others weren't very open to the pirates, and they were fine with that. It's not like they were looking for recognition or renown, they just wanted to be free. Jokes aside, let us go to our captains. I'm sure they'll like to know how our battles went before continuing the expedition. Ray said as she turned to the fight happening between the captains and floor boss, followed by the others and even the adventurers who were pulled underground by the gargoyle to protect them from the Juggernaut's strength. With the captains, the fight was a bit more long-winded in this case because of the cautious fighting style of the surface captains. This group of tactics included aiming for weak spots on the floor boss's body, such as its eyes, neck and abdomen, as well as hit-and-run tactics to whittle away at the monster's stamina. This didn't exactly work well with Kaido's direct attack style of fighting, which he used as soon as the floor boss was within reach. A moment after the former Emperor's first armor-shattering strike, Maxim and Herculeus saw the broken scales and immediately began attacking the areas that Kaido had hit before, while being cautious of the dragon's fire-emitting abilities. With the speed of the 2 captains and the overwhelming strength of the pirate captain, monster Rex Igneal was defeated in just under a minute after the fight began. Well, that was boring. Let's get the group together and continue the expedition. I want to get this over and done with, Kaido said while leaning his kanabo on his shoulder. Not a moment later did the others appear behind them, excited and ready for the next leg of the expedition, but first a much-needed break before they continued their journey. Floors 70 to 79. After a quick 10-minute break, the expedition was back on track and going through floor 70. This was a bit more difficult for the adventurers, mostly because of the rather grotesque appearance of everything on this floor. Not only were the monsters deformed and strange, but the trees on this floor were also monsters that, when awakened, stood up on their roots and lashed out in a violent frenzy. The floor itself was like some kind of horror museum shrouded in the canopy of a dark forest. There were many trees casting loads of creepy shadows across the ground. The trees themselves looked like deformed and tormented human faces. There were hundreds of large hairy spiders, 2-headed bats with fangs dripping with blood, and even a few groups of dog-like creatures with upside-down heads. After the first sneak attack by one of the creepy trees that resulted in the first serious injury in the deeper floors, it was a level 4 who had leaned against the tree for support before being impaled by one of its branches as the tree got up and revealed its true monstrous form. The branches looked like hands with long thin fingers, while what appeared to be embers within dark hollows within the bark were its eyes, while multiple giant gaunt mouths filled with thorns dripping a crimson sap onto the ground. After the incident and subsequent removal of the adventurer to the supporter's pocket and the death of the tree monster, it was unanimously decided that all of the trees and other living things on the floor needed to be burnt to the ground. So that's what they did, as they killed the deformed multi-limbed monsters and listened to the soul-rending screams of these eldritch trees, unknowingly causing damage to the sanity of those who were forced to listen to it for prolonged periods of time. After a quick discussion between the Familia and pirate captains, as well as the executives and pirate commanders, they decided to get as far down as quickly as possible, only stopping to take a quick breather before taking on whatever floor boss awaited them down here, as the Xenos pirates hadn't confirmed what it was or even seen it for that matter. With the new pace agreed upon, the group began tearing their way through the monsters at a rapid pace until they reached the 75th floor. With each floor passed, the floors became more and more horrifying, as monsters they were used to encountering began spawning once again, but they were deformed and strange. Like Lugaro with 4 muscular arms or feather-covered wings on the back of the Lizardman Elite. Things just kept getting stranger and stranger the deeper down they went, but they had a job to do, so they moved on until the 75th floor. This was the floor that the pirates had stopped at previously before returning to their base on the 50th floor. The reason for this soon became apparent as blue amorphous blobs began to crawl out of the crevices of the rocks and the living trees on the floor that also stood up on their roots and menacingly approached them along with the slimes. The adventurers were weary, and the following warning made them even more so. Be careful everyone, the trees are the same as before, but the slimes are the real issue. Their bodies are liquid, meaning they're immune to physical attacks without a magical attribute, unless you hit their magic stones, but they're able to move it around to avoid death from piercing attacks. Lastly, they're also immune to fire and will snuff out the trees you set ablaze. Light explained what he knew, and the reason why they turned back the last time became clear. Even though Kaido was there and most of the Xenos pirates were able to use haki, they were holding themselves back from using the ability openly to avoid more questions from the others. They had stopped on this floor the last time because at the time they believed that they had gotten far enough on their own and would return to go deeper at a later time, and that time had finally come. The battle with the slimes and tree gounts was much slower than on the previous floors for two main reasons, one being the fact that only magic worked and the other was the fact that the slimes were acidic and melted weapons, armor and other equipment. The tides of battle only turned when it was discovered that Ranye had a useful ability that made dealing with the slimes much easier, namely her dehydrating toxin that caused the slimes to evaporate until all that remained of them was their magic stones. Yes, finally I can do something more than hide in the back and sneak attack monsters, Ranye said as she motioned for the adventurers to cover their weapons in her dehydrating toxin, allowing their attacks to actually damage the monsters. She quickly focused on creating as much of the toxin as possible so that the others could use it as well. This caused many to become more bold in their attacks as they began to burn the trees once again. This unfortunately caused another problem with slimes consuming the fallen magic stones before Gross could pull them into the ground. After discovering the effectiveness of her toxin, all of the adventurers began covering their blades and arrows with the toxic fluid before attacking the slimes with reckless abandon. With the new discovery they were able to clear the 75th floor without too much trouble from then onwards. The following floors were slightly more difficult as they encountered more bizarre monsters alongside the horrifying trees, and acidic slimes were faceless, winged and sharp-clawed horrors that made no sound as they flew through the darkness of the floor they inhabited. These creatures once again gave Rei another opportunity to shine, as it were. She illuminated the room, exposing the horrors to her friends and allowing them to kill them easily. There were also giant six-armed furry monsters with vertical mouths filled with long fangs that made more than one adventurer stumble because of its hideous appearance. These creatures were incredibly strong, able to clash and actually trade blows with several level 6s at once without much trouble, but despite their strength they could be overwhelmed with superior numbers. Although the flying horses on the 78th floor were quite challenging to fight because of their incredible speed, only Rei and Kaido were able to keep up with them and knock them to the ground, where they were easily killed by the adventurers waiting below. It wasn't long before they reached the 79th floor and encountered the strangest thing they'd seen in the dungeon thus far, and that was saying something. There were no monsters on this floor except for one, the floor boss apparently, that was in the process of consuming and digesting the other monsters that the dungeon had birthed to kill the adventurers, but instead of going into battle against their sworn enemies they were all captured and killed by their own supposed ally. Seeing this set the entire expedition on edge. It was a well-known fact that the more magic stones monsters consumed the stronger they became, so just how strong was this monster after consuming so many? It had probably consumed thousands if not tens of thousands of them before it was discovered. At least now they could kill it before it became too strong to kill. At first they thought it was just a giant black amorphous slime, but what made it different from the others was that it had more than a dozen eyes floating in its fluid body. The giant slime seemed to be able to create any body part it had previously consumed as it suddenly shifted a part of its amorphous body into a hand with 12 clawed fingers pointing in odd directions and quickly impaled one of the broken-necked dog monsters that tried to flee. A moment after it had consumed the last of the monsters on the floor, one of its many eyes suddenly lurched in the direction of the expedition, causing several of them to flinch and draw their weapons while one woman screamed in terror. Immediately all eyes suddenly turned in their direction and the monster did something that none of them expected. It spoke, or yelled something that none of the adventurers or Xenos could understand. Tekali Li. Tekali Li. It cried as it charged at the group, who immediately scattered all around the room to avoid the gelatinous slime's tentacles. Ranye attacked with her dehydrating toxin, which immediately began dehydrating a part of the floor boss. To the shock of most of the people present, the floor boss suddenly isolated the toxin before violently expelling it from its body, leaving it none the worse for wear. Unfortunately for Ranye, the floor boss now had a lot of its attention on her and it didn't seem happy if its rage-filled cry was anything to go off of. Just as the battle was about to begin, Kaido, who had been analyzing the floor boss since they set foot on the floor, yelled out loudly. "Attack with everything you've got, this one is different from the others." The former emperor yelled as he charged at the monster, who changed its appearance from an amorphous slime to a fluid sphere with various sharp-tipped tentacles that were either covered in long branches like the trees they fought on the floors above, or the teeth, fangs and claws of other monsters, most likely ones it had already consumed. Without needing to ask anything, the pirates attacked, with the executives and their captains not far behind. Immediately magic casters began casting their spells while the warriors covered their weapons in Ranye's dehydrating toxin that had been placed into several large buckets for the sake of convenience. There were no hordes of monsters, so everyone could focus on the floor boss without distractions, except for the floor boss itself. After Kaido's shout, the floor descended into chaos as everyone began to fight a certain part of the giant floor boss. "What the hell is with this freaky thing?" one of the executives yelled as he chopped off a tentacle that had grown several eyes and mouths with which it yelled its battle cry. The severed tentacle quickly turned back into slime before returning back to the original body of the floor boss, at which point it had already regrown the tentacle and was back on the attack. The same thing was happening everywhere on the floor, with the floor boss's fluid body expelling the dehydrating toxin that covered the blades of its attackers. Even the pirates were unable to do permanent harm to the giant screaming slime's body despite attacking with hockey-enhanced strikes. It simply pulled its body back together after it was severed, even if it was clear that it felt great pain from each strike. Althea was forced to withdraw after the battle went on like this for well over an hour, with adventurers slicing and dicing the monster Rex's body, while the mages bombarded it with all kinds of magical attacks, except for fire-based ones because Light had tried to see if it would work, but it made things worse because after the slime was set ablaze they not only needed to fight a slime boss, but one that was now on fire. The only one having a slightly better time fighting the floor boss was Ryu, who could absorb nutrients through his roots and was able to shrink it somewhat every time his roots were able to impale it before the monster Rex was able to move its body away. The pirates, who noticed this, glanced at one another before an idea hit them. Kaido, seeing this, grinned before using his kanabo to knock the main part of the floor boss's body in Ryu's direction. Seeing what they were doing, Maxim ordered his executives to assist in any way they could. He wasn't entirely sure what the pirates were doing, but it seemed like they were trying to move the floor boss to a certain spot. The others quickly caught on when they saw the green dragon growing roots from various parts of its body. Upon closer inspection, said roots were actually absorbing the amorphous floor boss. The floor boss was not idle, however. It had begun growing sharp claws and fangs and was slashing and biting at the dragon in the hopes of injuring it severely enough that it would stop absorbing the gelatinous slime's body, but it was useless, as even though Ryu had even lost a limb to the floor boss's thrashing, it grew back quickly and was just as quickly ignored by the dragon, who continued its assimilation of the giant slime. It took almost 10 minutes for all of it to be absorbed by the dragon's body, and a few severed pieces of it tried to slither away but were quickly captured by the Xenos pirates, who could use observational haki and subsequently flung at the green dragon, who swallowed them whole. I think I've said this before, but that was a really anticlimactic end to such a long fight. Ray said as several other adventurers fell to their knees now that the fight was over. The two familias approached when it became clear that the floor boss had been defeated and that there was no longer any danger. I must admit, that was by far the most impressive display of combat synchronization I've ever seen. Well done, Xenos pirates. Herculea said as she approached the group standing around the slayer of the floor boss. Soon the rest joined them too and sat down to catch their breaths and get something to eat. It was nothing special, we were just trying to keep it busy until Ryu could sprout his all-consuming roots. Even with everything we hit it with, we weren't doing any permanent harm. Ray confessed with a sheepish expression before her captain spoke up as well. Well done, Ryu. I don't know why, but I have a feeling we'll be needing it again later. Kaido said seriously with a nod in the green dragon's direction. Hey Ryu, are you okay? I know you're used to draining monsters of their nutrients, but you've never consumed an entire floor boss before, so as vice captain I must ask if you're feeling okay. Ray asked her fellow commander and crew member. Ryu just grunted and made a few more growls while looking directly into the siren's eyes. Ray nodded as though the two of them were having a friendly one-sided conversation. After a while of this one-sided intelligent conversation with the golden siren speaking and the dragon growling at her, the pirate suddenly went wide-eyed as she exclaimed, "Wow, that's amazing. Could you show me please?" she exclaimed excitedly. Kaido stepped forward, as did Light and Gross, who had just pulled the supporters from his safe bubble. Okay, I'm a bit confused, what's going on? Althea asked as the others tilted their heads in confusion. To answer her question, Ryu suddenly growled and a set of 6 eyes suddenly opened along one of his raised arms, causing shock to spread amongst the adventurers. Ray spoke calmly to settle the fears she could see in some of their eyes. Alright everyone, the big flower dragon here gained some of the abilities of the floor boss by absorbing it. He's also still in full control though, so no need to worry. She grinned happily. The others still seemed slightly put off by the dragon's suddenly growing eyes on its arm, but soon disregarded it as the exhaustion of the battle with the floor boss finally caught up to them and they gave in to their need for rest and a filling meal. Obviously they kept their distance from the dragon. The Xenos pirates seemed to be celebrating their friend's new abilities. Some of the younger adventurers were a bit put off by the dragon's appearance, but the need for rest overpowered their discomfort as everyone eventually sat down and enjoyed a small meal and a well-needed break before continuing down into the depths of the dungeon once more. Just like all of the previous newly discovered floors and monsters, Floor 80 was a huge treasure chest of danger, adventure and new discoveries. Floor 80 to 89. The monsters on Floor 80 were even stranger than the monsters they encountered along the previous 9 floors, and that was saying something because of how weird the ones that came before. The description, ugly as Essen, fit these creatures perfectly. There were what appeared to be incredibly thin animals such as dogs, cats and rats to name a few, all furless with what appeared to be diseased and blistering skin. These beasts all possessed large bat-like wings and were quite capable of flying and dropping from above to attack with claws and fangs dripping with some crimson liquid that was too fluid to be blood. Regardless, no one wanted to see what these hell beasts could do, so they attacked and killed them as quickly as possible. This floor was cleared much faster than the previous ones because of how much everyone wanted to get off this floor. They had Zald burn everything that tried to attack from the ground, while Ray light bombed the airborne adversaries and, just like many times before, caused a few juggernauts to be born, but like had been discussed before, they were to be killed before any of them could even completely leave the walls of the dungeon. Thus the expedition continued with as much trouble as was expected, until they reached the floor boss of the 89th floor. They once again had to deal with a monster unlike any seen before. It was reminiscent of the ghoulish trees they had encountered on floor 70, the difference being that this thing had no eyes, but instead had several mouths jutting out of its main trunk, with dozens of tentacle-like branches waving through the air. The beast stood on 5 legs that ended in what looked like the hooved feet of some demonic herbivore. The doubts of what herbivore it was done away with when the floor boss suddenly let out a loud goat-like bleat that shocked many adventurers into action as the monster shambled towards them at a reasonably fast pace because of its massive size. The expedition attacked first at long range to see what magic worked best as they tried to keep their distance from its flailing tentacle branches. This turned out to be a good call after Kaido stepped forward and tanked one of the floor boss's strikes. Into the shock of the others, it sent him flying with a loud boom as the sound barrier broke before the former emperor crashed into the dungeon wall. A moment later laughter was heard. Woro. Ray, lied, this monster is strong, that attack actually hurt, so let's have some fun, shall we? He yelled excitedly as he charged with his commanders by his side. The adventurers were shocked for a moment before continuing their long-ranged assault on the Black Goat Tree as the leaders of the Xenos pirates attacked it with some excited fervor. Man, when did the dungeon become such a madhouse? Everyone is losing their minds the further down we go. At least we can think straight, right, Althea? Zald asked after he set the ground ablaze with his magic. He had been getting annoyed by the full scope of the hideous creatures the dungeon could spawn on these deeper floors. Althea, who was in the process of knocking the airborne monsters to the ground as they fought the increasingly maddening hordes, responded with her usual calm tone, though Zald could hear a wavering undertone in her words. I believe I'm fine, but I think the lower-ranked members will need some counseling when we return to the surface, she spoke before casting another quick chant attack magic that brought down almost 20 of the airborne monsters. It doesn't matter, let's just finish this expedition. I'm getting tired. Althea's words made Zald worry for her health even if he knew he couldn't do anything to help her in that regard. So he just did what he could, that being fighting with more gusto than before. If he couldn't stop her illness, he'd at least make her life as easy as possible by killing as many monsters as he could. With the Xenos pirates, this monster was by far the most difficult to deal with thus far, which was strange. It had no long-ranged attacks and was relatively slow when moving its body. The thing that made it so difficult to kill was the beast's monstrous durability. Kaido had hit it with 6 blast breaths, Ray had unleashed several mountain-leveling luminous kicks, while Light breathed fire on the floor boss. It was a tree, so it should burn, was his logic. Unfortunately, none of them worked. Even the whittling magic attacks from the other adventurers didn't really do much, so this boss fight was becoming a battle of attrition for everyone except the pirates, who were doing the dungeon equivalent to an upset ghost throwing all the furniture out of the house it was haunting. Ray, Lied, Gross, Ranye and Ryu were throwing everything they had at the floor boss over and over again. Though the floor boss was still alive, it was most definitely taking massive amounts of damage, just not enough to actually kill it. Kaido had been analyzing the floor boss and was happy to find one that would be a good fight that could at least keep up with him for a few hours, but now he needed to find a way to end this battle quickly. Maybe I should cut loose a bit too, he mumbled to himself. Kaido quickly transformed into his hybrid dragon form and flew to the ceiling of floor 89 with his flame clouds, with his trusted Kanabo, Hisaikai twirling above his head and emitting an insane amount of armament and conqueror's haki as he reached the peak of his flight, before falling and bringing down Hisaikai with a cry of 3 realms Ragnarok. The former emperor brought his weapon down with a 2-armed swing on the floor boss with enough force to send it to the ground before the ground broke and the defeated floor boss fell down onto the 90th floor, where it burst into black smoke as it died from the overwhelming strength of the Xenos pirates' captain. The room was left in an uncomfortable silence as the 2 familias and the Xenos pirates looked at their captain with comical shocked expressions. Althea knew of Kaido's strength firsthand, but this level of strength was far beyond what he had used against her, thankfully. And she wasn't sure if he had gotten this strong over the past few months or if he had been this strong from the beginning and just held back in his fight with her. The thought terrified her, but then she remembered that he didn't really fight anyone that didn't try to stop him from expressing his freedom. Saishi looked at Kaido with a strange expression on her face. The pirate captain was floating on one of his flame clouds as the muscles in his arms began to relax now that the fighting was over. Well everyone, let's take a break. Gross, do we have enough food and water left to continue the expedition? Kaido spoke loudly. A moment later, Gross along with all of the other supporters and the injured adventurers rose to the same level as the rest of them before a quick stock check was made by the supporters before the head supporter gave his report. Captains, if we ration the food and water as we have over the past 30 floors, we should be able to make it down another 10 or so floors with enough resources to make it back to the fruit trees on the 77th floor. He ended his report. I see, Maxim began as he looked at the eating adventurers and Xenos, then to Herculea and Kaido. The former gave a firm nod while the latter grinned excitedly. In that case, let's all get something to eat and take a small break before we continue, but before that, let's make our goal clear. Maxim began his final inspirational speech to his allies. No, his friends, they were much more than allies after all they had been through. We began this expedition to do something even the great Albert Waldstein and his group were unable to accomplish. But we will be the ones to do it, we will defeat all who stand against us. We will conquer the dungeon. His words filled the adventurers with determination as they grinned at his final words to them before raising their fists in a cheer as they prepared for the fight of their lives ahead of them. Floor 90 to 99. The expedition could have dived down through the hole Kaido had made when he defeated the previous floor boss to get to the next floor, but as they looked down into the hole all they could see was darkness continually. Even the highly sensitive users of Haki such as Ray and Lied could sense nothing down there. That was why they decided to take the stairs instead. Upon entering the 90th floor they were assaulted by strange yet familiar monsters. Without waiting for them the adventurers attacked and killed them without mercy. It was only after getting halfway through the floor that one of the adventurers recognized these monsters. "Hey, aren't these the monsters from the first few floors of the dungeon?" he asked as a large muscled dog-headed monster was impaled on his longsword. Several executives who heard him took a closer look at the monsters and saw that yes, these were the monsters from the first 10 floors. Although they were all more muscular and much bigger than their regular counterparts on the lower floors. This must be a stronger recreation of what exists in the dungeon, but if the level 1 monsters of the upper floors were suddenly at approximately level 3, what would the floor boss look like? This thought went through the minds of many who were also considering the terrifying possibilities. Regardless of the dangers, they had an expedition to complete so they pushed forward harder than before. With each floor the hundreds and sometimes thousands of monsters that appeared were much stronger than before. There were 12-foot-tall minotaurs, 3-headed hellhounds and even a few absolutely ripped ligerfangs. Surprisingly they discovered that each of these floors was a mirror to every group of 10 floors that came before, with the exception that each one's monsters were much stronger than their lower floor counterparts. The confusing thing about these floors was the fact that they had yet to encounter a single floor boss. The group was currently cutting down the enhanced elder dragons on the 96th floor and were yet to encounter a single floor boss. Which was a very welcoming turn of events as all of the monsters on these floors made even Lied's full Allosaurus form look like a dog in comparison. Not to mention the horrors of the 70s and 80s were much more terrifying than they were before. The deeper they went the more excited Kaido became as the regular monsters he was used to crushing under Hasaikai were suddenly much stronger and more resilient than before. Finally after almost 5 hours the group arrived on the 99th floor. The floor itself was massive. Althea was sure that at least a dozen of the 18th floor could fit on this floor with more room to spare. The place was so big that there were fragments of each and every floor they had passed before, from the moss-colored rocks on the upper floors to a giant waterfall that put the one in the Water Kingdom to shame. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The wind wasn't blowing and other than the sound of the waterfall there was nothing. Kaido broke the silence with a fact that everyone knew deep down but were afraid to voice. "This is the boss room on the 99th floor. Prepare yourselves for the battle of your lives." He ended his small speech as movement suddenly erupted all around them. Suddenly the massive floor came alive with monsters in their thousands from every terrain. They charged at the expedition force. They were outnumbered over 1,000 to 1 and yet not a single one of them turned to run from this battle. The first to move was Ray, who took to the skies to increase the range of her attacks. "Luminous rain," she yelled as the entire floor began to shine with the first stage of her attack. A literal downpour of laser beams from the ceiling of the floor shredded and annihilated the hordes of monsters, but with each that fell almost 100 would replace them. The hordes seemed almost endless and for all they knew that could have been the truth. As the monsters' hordes approached, the adventurers sprang into battle with battle cries that could be heard almost 5 floors above them while the Xenos pirates charged the monsters with all the willpower they could muster in the face of such adversity. Magic spells were sent flying along with poisoned arrows, explosive crystals and all manner of expletives as the two armies clashed with one another. It was absolute insanity of the highest order. This is the conclusion that Maxim had come to several floors above the current one. The Zeus Familia captain was currently slashing dozens of monsters apart with long-ranged air slashes that bisected the monsters that couldn't get out of the way quickly enough. This method of fighting was being used by all of the adventurers who were physically strong enough to do it. With a single sign of his hand the spearhead formation collapsed into an alternating flower pattern with the executives and captains of both familias and the commanders and reserve members of the Xenos pirates on the outside of the formation, while the followed by the level 6s making up the second ring, followed by the level 5s and 4s, all of which were warriors whose job was to kill anything that got past the executives. At the center of the formation were the archers and mages who were letting loose poisoned and or flaming arrows, while the mages were clearing the way for the entire formation by tearing massive gauges of death through the hordes of monsters in the direction of the stairs to the next floor. The only ones not a part of the formation were Kaido, Ray and Ryu, who were flying above the formation and were annihilating the airborne monsters. This method of combat worked until the group reached the center of the floor, when all of a sudden the entire floor shook almost like when a juggernaut was birthed, but this time the monsters stopped spawning. Only the ones that were already on the floor remained. The reason for this became clear when 7 giant monsters erupted from different parts of the floor. The adventurers who had the time to look were horrified by what they saw. There standing ahead of them were not 1 or even 2 but rather 7 monster Rexes that just spawned at once. Damn, the dungeon really doesn't want us to get to the next floor, does it? And look, these floor bosses are different from their upper floor counterparts. Lied said, pointing out the differences between these floor bosses and the ones who came before. The enhanced Goliath seemed to be much taller than the original. It was almost 25 feet tall with its body covered in what seemed to be a crystal armor over its head, chest, back, abdomen and legs. It also seemed to be wielding a sword made of the same crystal as its armor in one of its hands. The enhanced Amphisbaena wasn't much different from its upper floor's counterpart other than its 10 heads atop long snake-like necks. The enhanced Udias and Balur weren't much different besides the fact that Udias now had legs and was wielding its giant bone sword and Balur had 2 swords instead of 1. The other 4 were exactly the same as when they were encountered before. Most of the expedition was nervous about fighting so many floor bosses at once, but were snapped out of their fearful thoughts when a loud excited yell shook the air, "Woro! Let's get ready to rumble." The former emperor's exclamation brought everyone back to the battle at hand and quickly drew out a loud battle cry from the adventurers who began charging at the final bosses of the dungeon. And thus the final battle had begun. 5 hours later, it was over, the battle had been finished, the entire expedition lay exhausted on the ground with the dead floor bosses already dissipated into ashes, except for the slime boss that was once again consumed by Gryu's devil fruit ability. The battle was a brutal and tedious one that required the full effort and experience of all participants in the group to have even the slightest chance of winning against the opposing floor bosses. The perseverance and determination of all paid off, and even though many were injured in the battle and several lost one of their limbs, all of them managed to make it out alive, and now all that was left was to set foot on the 100th floor to finally end the expedition. After another few minutes the group mustered up the strength to get up and follow behind their captains. Even the pirates, except Kaido, were tired after all they went through and had just regained enough wits to continue to the next floor and see what was in store for them. Finally, after all they've been through, they can reach the end of their very first adventure. Floor 100. As the group walked down the stairs they tried to imagine what could be waiting for them at the bottom. Would it just be another filled with monsters that they had to kill, or was there something more, something that could change the world forever? It was no secret that the gods knew exactly what the dungeon was but refused to tell any of the mortals even when begged. The captains of the Zeus and Hera familias were no exception to this despite their high levels. And so as the group entered the 100th floor of the dungeon they found themselves disappointed. There was nothing on this floor besides a large body of water at the center of an otherwise empty room. They were expecting some monsters to jump out of hiding to kill them, but something much stranger began happening. The body of water at the center of the chamber suddenly began shifting and changing, creating beautiful waves as the liquid that now looked more like silver than water actually began to rise up in the air. The adventurers were on edge with their weapons drawn. The only ones who remained calm and collected were the Xenos pirates, who didn't react because their observational haki hadn't sensed anything dangerous from the liquid.